The collapse of Roman Britain in the early 5th century created a power vacuum that would fundamentally reshape the political and cultural landscape of post-imperial Britain. As Roman legions withdrew to defend the crumbling empire's continental territories, the Romano-British population found themselves facing unprecedented challenges from Saxon, Anglo, and Jute raiders who had transformed from occasional nuisances into organised invading forces. Within this chaotic transitional period emerged military leaders whose exploits would eventually crystallise into the legendary figure we know as King Arthur. Celtic warrior traditions provided the foundational military culture from which these resistance leaders emerged. The pre-Roman Celts of Britain had developed sophisticated martial customs centred around personal valour, loyalty bonds between warriors and their chieftains, and the concept of the war band as an extended family unit. Archaeological evidence from Iron Age hill forts across Wales, Cornwall, and northern England reveals defensive structures that required coordinated military planning and substantial manpower to construct and maintain. These fortifications, with their multiple ramparts, elaborate gateways, and strategic positioning on elevated terrain, demonstrate that Celtic societies possessed advanced understanding of siege warfare and territorial defence long before Roman conquest. The Celtic concept of the Tean or Tiana, a war leader who commanded through personal charisma and battlefield prowess rather than inherited authority, became particularly relevant during the post-Roman period. Unlike Roman military hierarchy based on formal rank structure, Celtic leadership emphasised individual combat skills, gift-giving to maintain warrior loyalty, and the ability to inspire followers through personal example. This tradition of charismatic military leadership would prove crucial as Romano-British communities sought defenders capable of organising effective resistance against Saxon expansion. Ambrosius Aurelianus emerges from historical sources as the most significant prototype for the Arthur figure. Gildas, writing in De Assidio Britanniae around 540 AD, describes Ambrosius as a Romano-British leader who rallied his people against Saxon invaders during the late 5th century. According to Gildas, Ambrosius came from a family that had worn the purple, indicating high Roman administrative rank, and possessed both the cultural authority of Roman tradition and the military capability necessary to organise sustained resistance campaigns. The historical Ambrosius likely operated from power bases in Western Britain, where Romano-British culture remained strongest after imperial withdrawal. Archaeological evidence from sites like Cadbury Castle in Somerset and Dinas Powys in Wales suggests that certain hill forts were reoccupied and strengthened during the 5th and 6th centuries, indicating organised defensive efforts by local leaders. These fortifications show evidence of Mediterranean imports, wine amphorae, fine pottery and metalwork, suggesting that their occupants maintained trade connections and possessed sufficient wealth to acquire luxury goods despite the political instability of the period. Ambrosius appears to have coordinated multiple Romano-British kingdoms in a series of campaigns that temporarily halted Saxon expansion westward. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records several defeats inflicted upon Saxon forces during the late 5th century, though it attributes these setbacks to various causes rather than acknowledging effective British resistance. However, the temporary cessation of Saxon territorial gains during this period, combined with archaeological evidence of destroyed Saxon settlements in contested border regions, supports the existence of organised British military activity under unified command. The military campaigns of this era required sophisticated logistical planning and coordination between previously independent British kingdoms. Evidence from weapon hoards discovered at sites like Sutton Hoo and Staffordshire suggests that warfare during this period involved heavily armed cavalry units supported by infantry formations, equipped with spears, shields, and seax knives. The Romano-British forces likely emphasised mounted warfare, drawing upon both Roman cavalry traditions and Celtic horse-breeding expertise that had developed in regions like the Welsh borderlands. Romano-British resistance leaders faced the challenge of defending territories that lacked the infrastructure support previously provided by Roman administration. Without regular supply lines, professional engineering corps, or centralized taxation systems, these leaders had to improvise military solutions using available local resources. Archaeological excavations at sites like Tintagel in Cornwall reveal evidence of metalworking activities, including the production of weapons and armour, suggesting that some Romano-British strongholds developed semi-industrial capabilities to support their military operations. The Saxon invasions followed patterns that exploited weaknesses in British defensive capabilities. Saxon forces typically advanced along river valleys, establishing fortified settlements that could control water transport routes and agricultural resources. British resistance required mobile forces capable of rapid response to Saxon incursions, while maintaining defensive positions that could withstand siege warfare. This dual requirement, mobility and defensive strength, shaped the military culture that would later be reflected in Arthurian literature's emphasis on both questing knights and fortified courts. Welsh oral traditions preserve detailed memories of these conflicts through bardic poetry and storytelling that predated written Arthurian literature by several centuries. The Mabinogion tales, though recorded in medieval manuscripts, contain narrative elements that scholars trace to much earlier oral compositions. These stories preserve names, locations, and cultural details that correspond to archaeological and historical evidence from the 5th and 6th centuries, suggesting that Welsh bardic tradition maintained relatively accurate historical memories across generations of oral transmission. The Mabinogion tale of Culhwch and Olwyn presents Arthur as a war leader commanding a band of warriors with supernatural abilities, but the underlying narrative structure reflects authentic Celtic military organisation. Arthur's court functions as a warband gathering place, where warriors receive equipment, plan campaigns, and distribute spoils of victory. The emphasis on hunting, feasting, and gift-giving in these tales mirrors archaeological evidence of elite material culture from post-Roman British sites. Early Welsh poetry, particularly the works attributed to Taliesin and Aneirin, provides additional insight into the warrior culture that produced Arthurian legends. The Gododin poems describe cavalry battles fought between British and Saxon forces in terms that emphasize individual heroism, loyalty between warriors, and the tragic nobility of defeat in hopeless circumstances. These poetic themes would later become central elements of Arthurian romance, but their origins lie in authentic historical experiences of 6th century warfare. The bardic tradition also preserved geographical knowledge that proves remarkably accurate when compared to modern archaeological discoveries. Welsh poems reference specific hill forts, river crossings, and battle sites that can be identified with actual locations where archaeological evidence confirms post-Roman military activity. This geographical precision suggests that oral tradition maintained detailed local knowledge of historical events across centuries of transmission. Archaeological investigation of post-Roman Britain reveals a complex material culture that bridges Celtic traditions and Roman influences while adapting to new political realities. Excavations at sites like South Cadbury, long associated with Arthurian tradition, show evidence of substantial refortification during the late 5th and early 6th centuries. The defensive works include timber-framed ramparts reinforced with stone, indicating engineering knowledge that combined Celtic hill fort construction techniques with Roman masonry skills. Material culture from these sites demonstrates continuing contact with Mediterranean regions despite political fragmentation. Wine amphorae from the eastern Mediterranean, fine pottery from North Africa, and metalwork are showing Byzantine influence appear in contexts associated with high-status individuals who likely served as military leaders. This evidence suggests that Romano-British elites maintained international connections that enabled them to acquire luxury goods and possibly military equipment from continental sources. Weapon finds from this period show technological innovation that responded to changing warfare requirements. Swords discovered at sites like Sutton Hoo display sophisticated pattern welding techniques that produce blades superior to earlier Roman military equipment. Spearheads show regional variations in design that may reflect different tactical preferences among various British kingdoms. The prevalence of horse equipment, bits, harness fittings and stirrups in high-status burials confirms the importance of cavalry warfare during this period. Hill fort excavations reveal defensive strategies adapted to contemporary siege warfare techniques. Gates were redesigned with complex approaches that exposed attackers to defensive fire from multiple angles. Ramparts were heightened and strengthened with timber frameworks that could absorb the impact of battering rams or catapult stones. Water supply systems were improved to enable defenders to withstand extended sieges. These modifications demonstrate that British military engineers possessed detailed knowledge of Saxon siege capabilities and developed effective countermeasures. The distribution of fortified sites across post-Roman Britain suggests a defensive strategy based on mutually supporting strongholds that could coordinate resistance efforts across large territories. Hill forts in Wales, Cornwall and northern England show evidence of simultaneous reoccupation during the late 5th century, indicating centralised planning that extended beyond individual kingdom boundaries. This coordinated defensive network would have required the kind of unified command structure that historical sources attribute to leaders like Ambrosius or Aurelianus. The transition from oral tradition to written documentation marks a crucial turning point in the development of Arthurian legend, transforming fluid bardic narratives into fixed historical accounts that would influence all subsequent versions of the Arthur story. The earliest written sources emerge from a period when Latin literacy coexisted with Celtic oral culture, creating documents that blend historical chronicle with legendary material in ways that modern readers often find challenging to interpret. These texts, produced by clerics and scholars working in monasteries across Wales, Ireland, and southwestern England, represent the first attempts to systematically record the military and political events of post-Roman Britain. Gildas's De Excidio Britanniae, composed around 540 AD, stands as the earliest substantial written account of the Saxon invasions and British resistance efforts. Writing as a contemporary witness to the aftermath of these conflicts, Gildas provides a perspective shaped by personal experience of the political instability and cultural transformation that followed Roman withdrawal. His work functions simultaneously as historical chronicle, moral treatise, and ecclesiastical polemic, combining factual reporting with theological interpretation in a manner typical of early medieval historiography. The text reveals an author deeply concerned with the spiritual implications of political events, viewing Saxon success as divine punishment for British moral failings, while acknowledging the reality of effective military resistance under capable leadership. Gildas describes the Battle of Baden Hill as a decisive engagement that temporarily halted Saxon expansion, though his account frustratingly omits specific details about commanders, tactics, or precise geographical location. He writes that this victory provided the British with a period of relative peace that lasted until his own time, suggesting that the battle occurred approximately 44 years before his composition of the text. This chronological framework places Baden Hill around 496, 500 AD, coinciding with archaeological evidence of Saxon settlement disruption in the Thames Valley and surrounding regions. Gildas emphasises the battle's significance as a turning point that reversed Saxon momentum and allowed British communities to recover their strength and reorganise their defences. The author's treatment of Ambrosius Aurelianus reveals important details about Romano-British leadership during this critical period. Gildas describes Ambrosius as the sole survivor of a Roman family that had achieved high administrative rank before the collapse of imperial authority. This background suggests that Ambrosius possessed both the cultural legitimacy derived from Roman tradition and the practical military experience necessary to coordinate resistance efforts across multiple British kingdoms. Gildas portrays him as a figure who rallied dispirited British forces and restored their confidence in their ability to resist Saxon conquest, though the text provides no specific information about his tactical methods or strategic planning. The geographical scope of Gildas's account encompasses the lowland regions of eastern and central Britain, where Saxon settlement was most intensive, but his perspective reflects the viewpoint of Western British communities that successfully maintained their independence. His descriptions of Saxon military capabilities emphasize their effectiveness in siege warfare and their ability to coordinate large-scale campaigns across extensive territories. He notes their practice of establishing fortified settlements that served as bases for further expansion, a strategy that required sophisticated logistical planning and substantial manpower resources. The text also reveals Saxon diplomatic skills in forming alliances with British leaders willing to accept subordinate status in exchange for local autonomy. Gildas's moral interpretation of these events reflects contemporary Christian theology that viewed political success as evidence of divine favour or punishment. He attributes Saxon victories to British moral corruption, particularly among the ruling classes, while suggesting that military resistance succeeded only when British leaders demonstrated proper Christian virtue. This theological framework influences his selection and presentation of historical material, emphasizing moral lessons rather than tactical details. However, his contemporary perspective provides valuable insight into the psychological impact of Saxon invasions on Romano-British society and the cultural factors that motivated resistance efforts. The text of De Excidio Britanniae survives in manuscripts that show evidence of later editorial modification, raising questions about the accuracy of specific details while confirming the general reliability of Gildas's historical framework. Comparison with archaeological evidence supports his chronology of Saxon expansion and British resistance, though modern scholars debate the precise identification of locations mentioned in his account. The work's influence on later historical writing was substantial, providing source material for subsequent chroniclers who often expanded upon Gildas's brief references to create more detailed narratives. Nennius's Historia Brittonum, compiled around 830 AD, represents a significant expansion of the historical record through its incorporation of diverse source materials, including earlier chronicles, genealogical records, and oral traditions. Writing nearly 3 centuries after the events he describes, Nennius had access to documentary sources that have since been lost, but he also relied heavily on legendary material that had developed around historical figures during the intervening period. His compilation method involved combining information from multiple sources without always reconciling contradictions or evaluating the reliability of different traditions, creating a text that preserves valuable historical data alongside obviously mythical elements. The Historia Brittonum provides the first explicit identification of Arthur as a military leader, describing him not as a king but as a dux bellorum who fought alongside British kings against Saxon invaders. This terminology reflects Roman military hierarchy, suggesting that Arthur functioned as a supreme commander coordinating the forces of multiple kingdoms rather than ruling territory in his own right. Nennius lists 12 battles in which Arthur participated, providing geographical references that allow modern scholars to trace the scope of his military campaigns across Wales, northern England, and the Scottish borderlands. The battle list begins with engagements at river crossings, the Glein, Dubgla and Bassus, indicating tactical situations where British forces sought to prevent Saxon armies from advancing into defensible terrain. River-crossing battles required precise timing and coordination between cavalry and infantry units, suggesting that Arthur commanded forces capable of complex tactical manoeuvres. The locations mentioned correspond to strategic points along major river systems, where archaeological evidence confirms military activity during the late 5th and early 6th centuries. Nennius describes the siege of Castle Gwinion as a victory achieved through Arthur's personal combat prowess, claiming that he single-handedly killed 960 enemies while bearing an image of the Virgin Mary on his shield. While the numerical claim clearly represents legendary embellishment, the reference to siege warfare and religious symbolism reflects authentic aspects of early medieval military culture. Siege operations required sustained coordination between multiple units and sophisticated understanding of fortification design, capabilities that would have distinguished elite commanders from ordinary war leaders. The account of the Battle of Baden Hill in the Historia Britonum expands upon Gildas's brief reference by attributing the victory specifically to Arthur and claiming that he personally killed 960 Saxon warriors during the engagement. This numerical exaggeration follows patterns common in early medieval battle narratives, where symbolic numbers conveyed the magnitude of victory rather than providing literal casualty counts. However, the emphasis on personal combat reflects authentic Celtic warrior traditions that valued individual heroism as a component of military leadership. Nennius's geographical references locate Arthur's campaigns across a wide territory, extending from the Welsh borders to the Scottish Highlands, suggesting either an extended chronological span for his military career or coordination with Allied forces operating in distant regions. The battle sites include locations in Lincolnshire, the Caledonian Forest, and the Severn Estuary, indicating strategic thinking that addressed Saxon threats along multiple invasion routes. This geographical distribution corresponds to archaeological evidence of British resistance efforts in regions where Saxon settlement encountered sustained opposition. The Historia Britonum also preserves genealogical material that connects Arthur to other documented British leaders of the period, though these family relationships may represent later attempts to establish political legitimacy rather than accurate kinship records. The text links Arthur to rulers in Wales and Cornwall, while suggesting connections to northern British kingdoms that maintained independence from Saxon conquest. These genealogical claims reflect the political importance that later Welsh dynasties attached to Arthurian associations. The Annales Cambriae, compiled during the mid-10th century, provides a chronological framework that places Arthur's career within the broader context of early medieval British history. This Welsh chronicle records events from the 5th through the 10th centuries, drawing upon earlier annalistic records that have not survived independently. The entries concerning Arthur are brief but significant, providing dates for the Battle of Baden Hill and the Battle of Camlan that allow historians to establish a chronological framework for his military career. The Annales Cambriae entry for the year 516 AD records the Battle of Baden Hill as a victory in which Arthur carried the cross of Christ for 3 days and nights, combining military achievement with religious symbolism in a manner typical of early medieval chronicle writing. This chronological placement aligns with Gildas's indirect dating of the battle and corresponds to archaeological evidence of Saxon settlement disruption during the early 6th century. The religious imagery reflects the importance of Christian identity in British resistance ideology, while suggesting that Arthur's forces maintained morale during an extended engagement. The Chronicle's entry for 537 AD describes the Battle of Camlan as a conflict in which both Arthur and Madraut fell, providing the first written reference to the internal strife that would become central to later Arthurian literature. The laconic phrasing suggests that this battle represented a catastrophic defeat for British forces, effectively ending the period of coordinated resistance that had begun with Ambrosius Aurelianus. The identification of Madraut as Arthur's opponent introduces the theme of betrayal that would develop into the Mordred narrative in subsequent literary treatments. The geographical implications of the Camlan reference point toward locations in Wales or Cornwall, where British forces might have retreated after losing control of more easterly territories. Archaeological evidence from hill forts in these regions shows evidence of abandonment or destruction during the mid-6th century, supporting the chronicle's suggestion that this period marked a decisive shift in the balance of power between British and Saxon forces. The battle's outcome appears to have eliminated the unified command structure that had coordinated British resistance efforts across multiple kingdoms. Early Welsh poetry provides additional insight into the historical context that produced Arthurian legends, though the relationship between poetic composition and historical events remains complex and contested. The Y Gododin poems, attributed to the bard Aneurin, describe a cavalry battle fought at Caertraeth around 600 AD, in which British warbands suffered catastrophic defeat while attempting to reclaim territory from Saxon settlers. While these poems do not directly reference Arthur, they preserve authentic details of 6th century warfare and warrior culture that illuminate the historical background of Arthurian tradition. The Y Gododin describes warriors equipped with mail armour, steel swords, and decorated shields who fought as heavy cavalry supported by infantry formations armed with spears and bows. The poems emphasise the importance of Meadhall culture in maintaining warrior loyalty, describing elaborate feasting and gift-giving ceremonies that bound fighters to their lords through personal relationships, rather than formal military hierarchy. These cultural details correspond to archaeological evidence from high-status burial sites of the period and provide insight into the social structures that supported military campaigns like those attributed to Arthur. The poetic treatment of battlefield defeat in the Y Gododin reveals psychological attitudes toward warfare that shaped early Arthurian narratives. The poems celebrate heroic death in hopeless circumstances while lamenting the loss of cultural traditions that died with fallen warriors. This elegiac tone reflects the broader experience of British communities that witnessed the gradual erosion of their political independence, despite individual victories against Saxon expansion. The poems preserve names and genealogical details that connect to other early Welsh sources, suggesting that bardic tradition maintained relatively accurate historical memory across generations of oral transmission. References to Arthur in early Welsh poetry remain fragmentary and elusive, often appearing in contexts that assume audience familiarity with his reputation, rather than providing detailed biographical information. The poem Pagurif y Porthor presents Arthur as the leader of a warband that includes warriors with supernatural abilities, but the underlying narrative structure reflects authentic military organisation of the post-Roman period. The poem's geographical references encompass locations across Wales and Cornwall, where archaeological evidence confirms post-Roman military activity. The Preidiwr NWFN describes Arthur's expedition to the otherworld fortress of Anuefen, a narrative that clearly belongs to mythological rather than historical tradition. However, the poem's descriptions of fortress architecture, siege warfare, and warrior equipment preserve authentic details of early medieval military culture. The emphasis on acquiring magical objects through military conquest reflects the importance of prestige goods in maintaining warrior loyalty and political authority during the post-Roman period. The transformation of Arthur from a shadowy post-Roman war leader into the magnificent king of medieval romance began with a single revolutionary text that would reshape European literature for centuries to come. Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae, completed around 1136, represented far more than a simple chronicle of British kings. It constituted a deliberate reimagining of British history that elevated native Celtic traditions to compete with the classical heritage of Rome and the emerging power narratives of Norman England. Writing in the scriptorium of Oxford, Geoffrey created a work that bridged the gap between scholarly Latin historiography and popular vernacular storytelling, producing a text that satisfied both learned clerics seeking historical authority and secular audiences hungry for tales of heroic adventure. Geoffrey's Arthur emerges as a fully realised monarch whose reign encompasses not merely the defence of Britain against Saxon invasion, but the conquest of vast territories extending across continental Europe. This dramatic expansion of Arthur's geographical sphere reflects Geoffrey's ambitious attempt to provide Britain with the imperial past that could rival the achievements of Charlemagne or the Roman emperors. The Historia presents Arthur as the ruler of an empire stretching from Ireland to the borders of Rome, commanding armies that include contingents from Scotland, Wales, Cornwall and Brittany, along with allied forces from Iceland, the Orkneys and Norway. This imperial vision required Geoffrey to invent detailed accounts of military campaigns, diplomatic negotiations, and administrative systems that had no basis in earlier sources, but possessed sufficient internal consistency to convince medieval readers of their historical authenticity. The political context of Norman England provided both the motivation and the audience for Geoffrey's historical revisionism. Writing during the reign of Henry I, Geoffrey addressed a society grappling with questions of legitimacy and cultural identity in the aftermath of the Norman conquest. The Norman elite required historical narratives that validated their rule over Anglo-Saxon England, while simultaneously establishing their own claims to ancient British heritage through their control of territories that had once belonged to Arthur's legendary kingdom. Geoffrey's work served these political needs by presenting the Norman conquest as the restoration of legitimate British rule rather than foreign invasion, while providing the Anglo-Norman aristocracy with heroic ancestors whose achievements surpassed those of their continental rivals. Geoffrey's mysterious claim to have based his work on a very ancient book in the British tongue that was given to him by Walter, Archdeacon of Oxford, has generated scholarly debate that continues to this day. No such source has ever been identified, and many historians suspect that Geoffrey invented this attribution to provide his largely fictional narrative with the authority of ancient documentation. However, the Historia does incorporate authentic elements from Welsh oral tradition, early chronicles, and genealogical records that suggest Geoffrey had access to genuine source materials, even if he embellished them beyond recognition. The question of his sources becomes particularly complex when examining his treatment of figures like Merlin, whose origins can be traced to Welsh prophetic tradition, and his detailed knowledge of British geographical locations that corresponds to actual topographical features. The introduction of Merlin represents perhaps Geoffrey's most significant innovation in Arthurian tradition. Drawing upon Welsh traditions surrounding the prophet Myrddin, Geoffrey transformed a regional Celtic seer into a figure of cosmic significance, whose magical powers shaped the destiny of Britain across multiple generations. Geoffrey's Merlin possesses abilities that extend far beyond simple prophecy, demonstrating mastery over natural forces that allows him to transport massive stone monuments from Ireland to England and to manipulate human reproduction through magical disguises. The wizard's role in Arthur's conception at Tintagel Castle established a pattern of supernatural intervention in royal succession that would become central to medieval romance literature. Geoffrey's account of Arthur's conception reveals sophisticated understanding of both Celtic magical traditions and contemporary political theory regarding royal legitimacy. The story of Uther Pendragon's transformation into the likeness of Gorlois, Duke of Cornwall through Merlin's magic, serves multiple narrative functions beyond simple romantic intrigue. The magical deception ensures that Arthur's birth occurs within the technical bounds of marriage, while simultaneously providing him with a connection to Cornwall's ancient royal lineage through his mother, Grain. This genealogical strategy allowed Geoffrey to link Arthur to both the Romano-British resistance tradition represented by his father Uther and the indigenous Celtic nobility of southwestern Britain through his maternal ancestry. The Tintagel setting for Arthur's conception demonstrates Geoffrey's skill in selecting locations that possessed both dramatic potential and historical resonance. The cliff-top fortress of Tintagel had served as an important stronghold during the post-Roman period, with archaeological evidence confirming its occupation by high-status individuals who maintained trade connections with Mediterranean regions. Geoffrey's description of the castle emphasises its natural defences and strategic position overlooking the Atlantic approaches to Britain, characteristics that would have been familiar to contemporary readers acquainted with Norman castle construction. The choice of this location also connected Arthur's origins to the maritime traditions of Celtic Britain, suggesting his future role as a ruler whose power would extend across the seas to continental territories. Uther Pendragon's characterisation in the Historia establishes him as a transitional figure who bridges the gap between the historical Romano-British resistance leaders and Geoffrey's idealised Arthurian monarchy. Unlike the shadowy war leaders described by earlier chroniclers, Uther possesses the full regalia and institutional structure of medieval kingship, holding court ceremonies, issuing royal charters, and maintaining diplomatic relationships with continental rulers. Geoffrey's Uther commands professional armies equipped with standardised weapons and armour, rather than the improvised warbands of post-Roman Britain, reflecting contemporary Norman military organisation projected backward into an imagined Celtic past. The introduction of Caliburn, later known as Excalibur, represents another of Geoffrey's crucial innovations in Arthurian tradition. Geoffrey describes the sword as having been forged in the mystical island of Avalon, establishing its supernatural origins while connecting it to Celtic otherworld traditions that would be developed further in later Romance literature. The weapon's name derives from the Welsh Caladfolc, suggesting that Geoffrey drew upon authentic Celtic sword traditions even as he transformed them into elements of medieval chivalric culture. Caliburn's role in Arthur's military victories emphasises the importance of superior weaponry in medieval warfare, while providing a tangible symbol of divine approval for Arthur's reign. Geoffrey's battle descriptions reveal detailed knowledge of 12th century military tactics and siege warfare projected onto his imagined 6th century setting. His account of Arthur's siege of Saxon-held cities includes technical details about battering rams, siege towers, and catapult operations that reflect contemporary Norman military engineering rather than post-Roman British capabilities. The coordination between cavalry charges and infantry formations in Geoffrey's battle narratives follows patterns developed during the Crusades, while his descriptions of naval warfare incorporate Mediterranean galley tactics that had no historical connection to early British maritime traditions. The continental campaigns that Geoffrey attributes to Arthur serve to establish British claims to European territories, while providing narrative frameworks for the international adventures that would become central to later Arthurian romance. Geoffrey's Arthur conquers Norway, Denmark and Gaul through a series of military campaigns that demonstrate strategic planning on a scale that would have been impossible for historical post-Roman British leaders. These fictional conquests allowed Geoffrey to present Arthur as the equal of Charlemagne or Alexander the Great, while establishing precedents for Norman territorial claims in France and other continental regions. Geoffrey's treatment of Arthur's court establishes the institutional foundations for the chivalric culture that would dominate later medieval literature. The Round Table makes its first appearance in Geoffrey's work as a symbol of equality among Arthur's knights, though Geoffrey provides little detail about its physical characteristics or the ceremonies associated with it. The court's location at Caerleon on Usk reflects Geoffrey's knowledge of Roman military installations in Wales, as the site had served as the headquarters for the Second Augustan Legion during the imperial period. Geoffrey's description of Caerleon emphasises its strategic position and impressive architecture, creating an image of royal magnificence that would influence all subsequent depictions of Arthurian court culture. The political structure of Geoffrey's Arthurian kingdom reflects 12th century feudal organisation rather than authentic post-Roman British governance systems. Arthur rules through a hierarchy of nobles who hold territorial grants in exchange for military service, a system that mirrors Norman administrative practices in England and their continental territories. Geoffrey's Arthur issues royal charters, maintains professional diplomatic corps, and operates sophisticated taxation systems that bear no resemblance to the improvised political structures of early medieval British kingdoms, but provide contemporary readers with familiar governmental frameworks. Geoffrey's account of Arthur's final campaign against the Roman Empire serves multiple ideological functions within the broader narrative structure of the Historia. The fictional war against Emperor Lucius Tiberius allows Geoffrey to present Arthur as the rightful heir to Roman imperial authority, while simultaneously depicting Rome as a declining power unable to maintain its territorial claims. This reversal of historical reality provided Norman audiences with a vision of British imperial destiny that justified their own territorial ambitions, while celebrating the superiority of Northern European military culture over Mediterranean civilization. The Battle of Saucy, where Geoffrey's Arthur defeats the Roman army in Gaul, incorporates tactical elements drawn from contemporary accounts of Crusader victories in the Holy Land. Geoffrey describes coordinated charges by heavily armoured cavalry supported by disciplined infantry formations using crossbows and siege equipment, military techniques that had proven effective against Byzantine and Islamic forces during the early 12th century. The scale of the battle, involving armies numbering in the tens of thousands, reflects the massive military mobilisations of Geoffrey's own era, rather than the smaller warbands that characterised early medieval British warfare. Geoffrey's handling of Arthur's death and the circumstances surrounding the Battle of Camlan demonstrates his skill in transforming the laconic references found in earlier chronicles into dramatically compelling narrative episodes. The betrayal by Mordred, who Geoffrey identifies as Arthur's nephew rather than son, provides a personal dimension to political conflict while establishing themes of family loyalty and dynastic succession that would resonate with Norman aristocratic audiences. The final battle occurs after Arthur's return from his continental campaigns, suggesting that internal divisions rather than external enemies ultimately destroyed his kingdom. The mysterious departure to Avalon for the healing of Arthur's wounds creates an open ending that allows for the possibility of return while acknowledging the historical reality of British defeat by Saxon forces. Geoffrey's Avalon represents a synthesis of Celtic otherworld traditions with Christian concepts of resurrection and redemption, providing a conclusion that satisfies both pagan and Christian interpretative frameworks. This ambiguous ending would prove crucial for later developments in Arthurian literature, as it allowed subsequent authors to explore themes of loss, hope, and cultural continuity that spoke to audiences experiencing their own periods of political uncertainty. The immediate impact of Geoffrey's Historia Regum Britanniae exceeded anything its author could have anticipated, with manuscript copies circulating throughout Europe within decades of its completion. The work provided source material for vernacular adaptations in French, German, English, and other European languages, establishing narrative patterns and character relationships that would influence literary development for centuries. Geoffrey's transformation of Arthur from war leader to king created the foundation for medieval romance literature, while providing political legitimacy for emerging European monarchies that claimed descent from his fictional British Empire. The literary landscape of 12th century France provided the perfect environment for transforming Geoffrey of Monmouth's imperial Arthur into the sophisticated monarch of courtly romance. The emergence of vernacular literature in the courts of northern France coincided with the development of new social ideals that emphasized refined behaviour, emotional sophistication, and the cultivation of aristocratic leisure activities. Within this cultural context, Chrétien de Troyes revolutionized Arthurian literature by shifting focus from military conquest to personal adventure, from political authority to individual psychology, and from historical chronicle to romantic exploration of human relationships. Chrétien's 5 Arthurian romances, composed between approximately 1170 and 1190, established the fundamental narrative patterns that would define medieval romance literature for the next 3 centuries. Working under the patronage of Marie de Champagne and Philip of Flanders, Chrétien addressed audiences that included the most sophisticated and culturally influential nobles of Northern Europe. These patrons demanded literature that reflected their own social values while providing entertainment that demonstrated their refined tastes and intellectual sophistication. Chrétien's genius lay in his ability to combine Celtic narrative materials with contemporary French social ideals, creating works that satisfied both the desire for exotic adventure and the need for recognisable cultural frameworks. Eric Eternide, Chrétien's earliest Arthurian romance, introduces the concept of individual knightly adventure within the broader context of Arthur's court. Unlike Geoffrey's Arthur, who functions primarily as a military commander and political ruler, Chrétien's Arthur serves as the ceremonial centre of a chivalric community, where knights prove their worth through personal quests, rather than collective military campaigns. The court at Camelot becomes a staging ground for individual adventures, rather than a command centre for imperial conquest, reflecting the transformation of medieval aristocratic culture from warrior bands focused on territorial expansion to courtly societies emphasising personal refinement and social display. The character of Eric demonstrates Chrétien's sophisticated understanding of aristocratic psychology and social dynamics. Initially presented as a knight whose marriage to Enid threatens to diminish his reputation for martial prowess, Eric must navigate the tension between domestic contentment and chivalric achievement that challenged real medieval nobles attempting to balance family responsibilities with military careers. Chrétien's exploration of this conflict reveals deep insight into the social pressures that shaped aristocratic behaviour during the 12th century, when extended periods of relative peace allowed noble families to develop more complex domestic arrangements while maintaining military readiness for periodic campaigns. The adventures that Eric undertakes to restore his reputation follow geographical patterns that reflect actual travel routes used by 12th century French nobles moving between their various territorial holdings. Chrétien's descriptions of castles, towns, and wilderness areas correspond to real locations in northern France and the Low Countries, suggesting that his audience possessed detailed knowledge of these regions through personal experience. The material culture described in the romance, weapons, armour, clothing, and architectural details matches archaeological evidence from contemporary aristocratic sites, indicating that Chrétien grounded his fantastic narratives in recognisable social realities. Enid's role in the romance introduces themes of female agency and marital partnership that distinguished courtly literature from earlier heroic traditions. Unlike the passive wives and daughters who appear in Geoffrey's Historia, Enid actively participates in her husband's adventures while maintaining her own moral authority and decision-making capabilities. Her ability to provide crucial warnings and strategic advice during their travels reflects the actual political influence exercised by aristocratic women in 12th century France, where noble marriages created partnerships that combined territorial holdings and required coordinated management of complex estate systems. Cligères Chrétien's second romance explores themes of inheritance, legitimacy, and political succession that resonated strongly with contemporary French audiences experiencing rapid changes in feudal law and administrative practice. The story's Byzantine setting allows Chrétien to examine questions of cultural identity and political loyalty that reflected the international scope of 12th century aristocratic society. French nobles regularly participated in crusading expeditions, diplomatic missions, and marriage alliances that connected them to courts across Europe and the Mediterranean, creating a cosmopolitan culture that valued knowledge of foreign customs and political systems. The romance's treatment of love and marriage reveals the influence of contemporary theological and legal developments that were reshaping aristocratic family structures. Chrétien's characters navigate complex emotional relationships that require careful attention to both personal desire and social obligation, reflecting the actual challenges faced by noble families whose marriage arrangements served multiple political and economic functions. The emphasis on consent, mutual affection, and emotional compatibility in the romance corresponds to evolving church doctrine regarding marriage, while acknowledging the practical constraints that limited individual choice in aristocratic unions. Le Chevalier de la Charrette, dedicated to Marie de Champagne, represents Chrétien's most sophisticated exploration of courtly love ideology and its implications for chivalric behaviour. The romance of Lancelot and Guinevere established narrative patterns that would dominate European literature for centuries, but Chrétien's treatment of their relationship reveals considerable ambivalence about the social and moral implications of adultery within aristocratic society. The tension between personal passion and social duty that drives the narrative reflects real conflicts experienced by medieval nobles whose emotional lives were constrained by political marriages and feudal obligations. Lancelot's willingness to ride in a cart of shame to rescue Guinevere demonstrates the extent to which courtly love ideology challenged traditional concepts of masculine honour and social hierarchy. The cart episode forces readers to consider whether devotion to a lady justifies behaviour that would normally be considered degrading or socially inappropriate. Chrétien's handling of this moral dilemma reveals sophisticated understanding of the psychological tensions created by competing value systems within 12th century aristocratic culture. The Swordbridge episode, where Lancelot crosses a river on a blade to reach Guinevere's prison, combines supernatural adventure with detailed psychological analysis of courage, determination, and physical endurance. Chrétien's description of Lancelot's careful preparation for the crossing, his methodical approach to the dangerous traverse, and his stoic acceptance of the pain involved reflects contemporary understanding of knightly training and mental discipline. The episode demonstrates how courtly romance could transform fantastic narrative elements into vehicles for exploring realistic human psychology and moral choice. The rescue of Guinevere from Meleagant's castle incorporates elements of actual siege warfare and castle architecture familiar to Chrétien's audience from their own military experience. The descriptions of defensive walls, gate mechanisms, and interior layouts correspond to contemporary castle design, while the tactical problems involved in assault and defence reflect real strategic challenges faced by 12th century military commanders. This grounding of fantastic adventure in recognisable military realities helped medieval audiences relate to the emotional and psychological dimensions of the narrative. Le Chevalier au Lion presents Ivan's adventures as an exploration of the relationship between individual achievement and social responsibility within chivalric culture. The romance examines how personal glory-seeking can conflict with obligations to family, community, and feudal superiors, issues that confronted real medieval nobles whose military careers required extended absences from their territorial holdings. Chrétien's treatment of these themes reveals deep understanding of the practical challenges involved in maintaining political authority and social relationships across the geographical distances that characterised medieval aristocratic life. The magical spring that initiates Yvain's adventures represents a synthesis of Celtic otherworld traditions with contemporary French interest in natural philosophy and scientific observation. Chrétien's description of the spring's properties and the storm that results from disturbing it reflects 12th century attempts to understand meteorological phenomena through systematic observation and theoretical analysis. The episode demonstrates how courtly romance could incorporate contemporary intellectual interests, while maintaining the sense of wonder and supernatural intervention that distinguish the genre from purely realistic literature. Yvain's relationship with Ludine explores themes of conquest, marriage, and political integration that reflected actual patterns of territorial expansion and consolidation in 12th century France. The rapid transformation from military enemy to husband and lord reveals the practical considerations that often determined aristocratic marriage arrangements, where political necessity could override personal animosity or emotional preference. Chrétien's handling of this relationship demonstrates sophisticated understanding of how medieval noble families adapted to changing political circumstances while maintaining social stability and economic productivity. The lion that becomes Yvain's companion represents more than simple fantastic embellishment, functioning as a symbol of the natural authority and protective power that medieval political theory attributed to legitimate rulers. The beast's loyalty and courage in defending Yvain reflect contemporary ideas about the relationship between moral virtue and political effectiveness, while its ability to discriminate between friend and enemy suggests the kind of practical wisdom required for successful governance. The partnership between knight and lion creates a model of cooperative leadership that would have resonated with medieval audiences familiar with the challenges of coordinating military campaigns and administrative responsibilities. Percival ou Le Comte du Graal introduces the most significant innovation in Chrétien's Arthurian corpus through its presentation of the Grail as a mysterious object whose significance transcends material value or political power. The Grail's first appearance in literature occurs during Percival's visit to the Fisher King's castle, where it forms part of a strange procession that includes a bleeding lance and other enigmatic objects whose meaning remains unexplained. Chrétien's deliberate ambiguity regarding the Grail's nature and purpose created interpretive possibilities that would generate centuries of literary exploration and theological speculation. The Fisher King's wound and his castle's mysterious properties establish connections between physical suffering, spiritual crisis, and environmental sterility that reflect contemporary Christian theology regarding sin, redemption, and divine grace. The wasteland that surrounds the castle represents a condition of spiritual and material desolation that can only be healed through appropriate ritual action and moral understanding. Chrétien's presentation of these themes draws upon both Celtic traditions regarding wounded kings and Christian concepts of salvation history, creating a narrative framework that could accommodate multiple levels of allegorical interpretation. Percival's failure to ask the appropriate question about the Grail procession demonstrates Chrétien's interest in exploring the relationship between knowledge, understanding, and moral responsibility. The young knight's silence results from his adherence to conventional social etiquette rather than lack of curiosity or compassion, suggesting that proper behaviour in ordinary circumstances may prove inadequate when confronting spiritual mysteries. This theme reflects contemporary theological debates about the relationship between human reason and divine revelation, particularly the question of whether salvation requires special grace beyond normal moral and intellectual capabilities. The hermit episode, where Percival learns about his family history and receives spiritual instruction, reveals Chrétien's sophisticated understanding of contemporary monastic theology and penitential practices. The hermit's explanation of the Grail's Christian significance transforms what initially appeared to be a Celtic magical object into a symbol of Eucharistic devotion and sacrificial love. This theological reinterpretation demonstrates how 12th century French culture assimilated Celtic narrative materials by discovering Christian meanings within apparently pagan symbols and stories. Gawain's parallel adventures in the Percival romance provide contrast to the spiritual quest narrative, while exploring different aspects of chivalric culture and social responsibility. Gawain's encounters with various ladies and his involvement in complex feudal disputes reflect the actual political and social challenges that confronted medieval nobles in their daily lives. His adventures emphasize diplomatic skill, social grace, and practical problem-solving rather than spiritual enlightenment, creating a balance between transcendent and worldly concerns that characterize the best medieval romance literature. The development of individual night stories within Chrétien's corpus reflects the increasing specialization and psychological sophistication of 12th century French literature. Each major knight develops distinctive characteristics and areas of expertise that distinguish him from his companions, while contributing to the overall diversity and richness of Arthurian court culture. Lancelot embodies the ideal of perfect courtly love. Gawain represents social sophistication and diplomatic skill. Yvain demonstrates the balance between individual achievement and social responsibility, while Percival explores the relationship between chivalric virtue and spiritual enlightenment. The trouvères who adapted and expanded upon Chrétien's innovations understood that their aristocratic audiences required entertainment that reflected their own social values and cultural aspirations, while providing escape from the practical constraints of medieval political life. The transformation of Celtic warrior tales into French courtly romance involved systematic modification of narrative elements to emphasize psychological complexity, emotional sophistication, and social refinement rather than simple military prowess or political power. This cultural translation process required deep understanding of both Celtic source materials and contemporary French social ideals, creating works that satisfied multiple audiences while establishing new literary standards and expectations. The geographical settings of French Arthurian romance reflect the international scope of 12th century aristocratic culture, with adventures occurring across Britain, France, Germany, and other European regions familiar to noble audiences through military campaigns, diplomatic missions, and family connections. The detailed descriptions of castles, courts, and landscapes in these romances demonstrate the author's extensive knowledge of European geography and architecture, while their treatment of local customs and political systems reveals sophisticated understanding of regional variations in feudal organisation and social practice. The transformation of Arthurian literature from secular romance to spiritual quest narrative reached its culmination through the systematic Christianization of Celtic magical elements, most notably the metamorphosis of the Grail from Chrétien's mysterious vessel to the central symbol of medieval Christian mysticism. Robert de Boron's revolutionary Joseph d'Arimathie and Merlin, composed around 1200, established the theological framework that would dominate Arthurian literature for the remainder of the medieval period. Working within the intellectual environment of early 13th century France, where Cistercian monasticism and scholastic theology were reshaping European religious culture, Robert created a comprehensive mythological system that traced the Grail's origins to the crucifixion itself, while establishing its ultimate destination as Arthur's Britain. Robert's Joseph d'Arimathie begins with the biblical account of Christ's burial, transforming Joseph of Arimathea from a minor gospel figure into the founder of a hereditary priesthood responsible for preserving the most sacred relic of Christian history. According to Robert's narrative, Joseph collected Christ's blood in the cup used at the Last Supper, creating a vessel that combined Eucharistic significance with the physical reality of divine sacrifice. This theological innovation resolved the ambiguity surrounding Chrétien's Grail by providing it with unambiguous Christian credentials, while maintaining its supernatural properties and mysterious power. The cup's dual nature as both liturgical object and magical talisman allowed subsequent authors to explore themes of sacramental theology, while preserving the sense of wonder and otherworldly intervention that distinguished Romance literature from purely devotional writing. During his captivity, Joseph receives direct instruction from the risen Christ regarding the cup's proper use and the establishment of appropriate guardianship traditions. These supernatural revelations provide divine authorization for the Grail's eventual transfer to Britain while establishing the theological principles that would govern its operation in subsequent narratives. The 42 years of Joseph's imprisonment, sustained entirely by the Grail's miraculous power, demonstrate the vessel's ability to provide both physical and spiritual nourishment to those deemed worthy of its protection. Robert's account of the Grail Company's journey to Britain incorporates elements of early Christian missionary history with Celtic migration legends, creating a narrative that bridges biblical history and British prehistory. The travellers carry with them not only the Grail itself, but also the complete theological and liturgical knowledge necessary for establishing Christian worship in pagan Britain. Their arrival predates both Roman conquest and Anglo-Saxon invasion, providing Britain with Christian credentials that predate those of continental Europe while explaining the supernatural elements that characterise the British landscape in Arthurian romance. The establishment of the Grail Castle in Britain creates a permanent sanctuary where divine power remains accessible to worthy seekers throughout subsequent history. The genealogical connections that Robert establishes between Joseph's family and the later Grail Guardians create a hereditary priesthood that parallels but remains distinct from the institutional church hierarchy. The Fisher King lineage derives its authority directly from apostolic succession through Joseph rather than from papal appointment or episcopal ordination, providing an alternative source of religious legitimacy that could function independently of established ecclesiastical institutions. This theological innovation allowed medieval authors to explore themes of spiritual authority and religious authenticity, while avoiding direct criticism of contemporary church practices and personnel. Robert's Merlin expands upon Geoffrey of Monmouth's characterization by providing the wizard with explicit Christian credentials and divine authorization for his role in British history. Unlike Geoffrey's Merlin, whose powers derive from ambiguous supernatural sources, Robert's prophet receives his abilities through direct divine intervention, designed to counteract demonic influences threatening Christian Britain. The circumstances of Merlin's conception, involving demonic attempts to create an antichrist figure thwarted by his mother's piety and baptismal grace, establish him as a liminal figure capable of wielding supernatural power for divine purposes while remaining vulnerable to spiritual corruption through pride or moral failure. The relationship between Merlin and the Grail tradition in Robert's work creates a unified theological framework that encompasses both political and spiritual dimensions of Arthurian legend. Merlin's prophetic knowledge includes detailed understanding of the Grail's history and future destiny, allowing him to coordinate Arthur's reign with the broader divine plan for Christian Britain. The Round Table's establishment serves not merely as a symbol of chivalric equality, but as a deliberate recreation of the table fellowship that characterized both the Last Supper and Joseph's Grail ceremonies. The Siege Perilous, the empty seat reserved for the perfect Grail Knight, represents the intersection of political and spiritual authority within Arthur's kingdom. The Castel Saint Grail, composed around 1220 within Cistercian monastic circles, represents the most sophisticated theological treatment of Arthurian material in medieval literature. This anonymous work transforms the entire structure of chivalric romance by subordinating military adventure to spiritual development and replacing secular achievement with mystical experience as the ultimate goal of knightly endeavour. The Kest addresses an audience familiar with contemporary monastic theology and contemplative practices, requiring readers to understand complex allegorical relationships between narrative events and spiritual realities. The opening of the Kest establishes a clear distinction between earthly and heavenly chivalry through the dramatic transformation that occurs when Galahad takes his place at the Round Table. The appearance of the Grail at Camelot, covered by white silk and accompanied by supernatural light and fragrance, creates a moment of divine revelation that exposes the spiritual inadequacy of conventional chivalric culture. The knights' inability to see the Grail clearly reflects their moral and spiritual preparation, while their immediate desire to seek it demonstrates both proper religious aspiration and dangerous spiritual presumption. Galahad's introduction as the perfect Grail Knight required careful theological justification to explain how human nature could achieve the spiritual perfection necessary for direct communion with divine mysteries. The quest presents Galahad as a figure whose genealogical inheritance from both Davidic and Grail lineages provides him with unique spiritual capabilities, while his lifelong commitment to perfect chastity and devotional practice ensures his moral worthiness. Unlike earlier Arthurian heroes whose achievements result from military prowess or courtly sophistication, Galahad succeeds through contemplative discipline and mystical union with divine will. The displacement of Percival from his position as the primary Grail Knight reflects changing theological emphases within 13th century monasticism, particularly the Cistercian preference for contemplative perfection over penitential struggle. While Chrétien's Percival achieves spiritual insight through learning from his mistakes and receiving appropriate instruction, the quest's Galahad possesses innate spiritual perfection that requires no development or correction. This theological shift mirrors contemporary debates within monastic circles regarding the relationship between human effort and divine grace in achieving mystical experience. Percival's role in the quest emphasizes the spiritual value of earnest seeking and gradual purification, even when perfect achievement remains impossible. His adventures demonstrate how conventional chivalric virtues can be transformed into spiritual disciplines through proper understanding and motivation, while his ultimate failure to achieve complete Grail vision illustrates the limitations of human effort without divine grace. The parallel between Percival's spiritual journey and the experiences of ordinary religious seekers made his character particularly valuable for readers attempting to apply Grail symbolism to their own devotional lives. Bors' survival and return to Camelot serves crucial narrative functions by providing witness testimony regarding the Grail achievements, while demonstrating how mystical experience can be integrated into ordinary Christian life. Unlike Galahad and Percival, whose spiritual perfection removes them from earthly concerns, Bors maintains his family responsibilities and social obligations, while achieving sufficient spiritual development to participate in Grail mysteries. His character represents the possibility of combining contemplative achievement with active engagement in secular affairs, a theological position that appealed to lay audiences seeking spiritual advancement without abandoning their worldly responsibilities. The monastic influences that shape the quest reflect the intellectual sophistication of early 13th century Cistercian theology, particularly the synthesis of mystical tradition with scholastic methodology that characterized the work of figures like Bernard of Clairvaux and William of Saint-Thierry. The text's systematic use of allegorical interpretation follows established monastic hermeneutical practices, while its detailed analysis of spiritual psychology draws upon contemporary understanding of contemplative experience and mystical union. The integration of Arthurian narrative with monastic theology required extensive knowledge of both secular literary tradition and religious contemplative practices. The geographical symbolism of the quest transforms the British landscape into a spiritual topography where physical locations correspond to stages of mystical development and moral purification. The wasteland surrounding the Grail castle represents the condition of fallen creation awaiting redemption through divine intervention, while the various adventures encountered by the questing knights symbolize the temptations, trials, and revelations that characterize the contemplative journey. The movement from Camelot to Corbenic parallels the soul's progression from worldly attachment to mystical union, with each stage requiring specific virtues and insights for successful completion. The supernatural events that punctuate the quest narrative serve didactic functions by illustrating theological principles through dramatic action and symbolic imagery. The appearance of white stags, mysterious voices, and miraculous healings demonstrates divine intervention in human affairs, while providing opportunities for allegorical interpretation and moral instruction. The text's systematic explanation of these supernatural elements through hermit encounters and angelic revelations ensures that readers understand their theological significance, rather than treating them as mere fantastic entertainment. The integration of Eucharistic symbolism throughout the quest reflects contemporary developments in sacramental theology, particularly the growing emphasis on transubstantiation doctrine and the spiritual effects of mass participation. The Grail's function as the vessel of Christ's blood connects it directly to the Eucharistic cup, while its miraculous feeding of worthy recipients parallels the spiritual nourishment provided by sacramental communion. The elaborate Mass celebrated by Christ himself at Corbenic represents the ultimate liturgical experience that transcends earthly worship, while providing the model for proper sacramental understanding. The treatment of chivalric violence in the quest reveals sophisticated theological analysis of the moral problems created by military culture within Christian society. The text distinguishes between justified violence undertaken for spiritual purposes and sinful aggression motivated by pride, anger, or worldly ambition, while acknowledging the practical difficulties involved in making such distinctions during actual combat situations. The spiritual adventures that replace conventional tournament and warfare demonstrate how chivalric energy can be redirected toward contemplative goals without abandoning the heroic ideals that motivated knightly culture. The female figures who appear throughout the quest represent various aspects of spiritual development and moral choice, from the demonic temptresses who attempt to corrupt the questing knights to the holy women who provide guidance and assistance during crucial moments. The careful theological analysis of these encounters reflects contemporary monastic understanding of gender symbolism and the role of feminine imagery in mystical literature. The text's treatment of sexuality and celibacy demonstrates sophisticated appreciation for the psychological challenges faced by religious individuals attempting to maintain chastity while remaining engaged with secular society. The conclusion of the quest at Corbenic, where Galahad achieves perfect vision of Grail mysteries before departing for heavenly realms, establishes the ultimate goal of Christian spiritual development while acknowledging its rarity and difficulty. The healing of the maimed king and the restoration of the wasteland demonstrate the cosmic significance of individual spiritual achievement, suggesting that mystical union benefits not only the contemplative but the entire created order. The disappearance of the Grail from Britain following Galahad's death represents the end of a particular phase of salvation history, while leaving open the possibility of future divine interventions under different circumstances. The monumental achievement of the Vulgate cycle, also known as the Lancelot Grail cycle, represents the most ambitious attempt in medieval literature to create a comprehensive narrative universe encompassing the entire sweep of Arthurian history from its mystical origins to its tragic conclusion. Composed between approximately 1215 and 1235 by anonymous authors working within interconnected scriptoriums across northern France, this massive prose compilation synthesized decades of Romance tradition into a unified narrative structure that would dominate European Arthurian literature for the remainder of the medieval period. The cycle's 5 major components, the Histoire del Saint Graal, Histoire de Merlin, Lancelot, Quête del Saint Graal, and Mort d'Arthur, together comprise over 3,000 manuscript pages in modern editions, making it one of the largest literary undertakings of the medieval period. The decision to compose this vast narrative in prose rather than verse reflected fundamental changes in literary culture and audience expectations during the early 13th century. Prose format allowed for more detailed psychological analysis, complex narrative structures, and sophisticated exploration of moral and theological themes that would have been difficult to sustain within the metrical constraints of earlier Romance poetry. The prose medium also enabled the anonymous authors to incorporate extensive dialogue, detailed descriptions of material culture, and elaborate explanations of symbolic meanings that transformed Arthurian literature from entertainment into serious literary art capable of addressing the most profound questions of medieval Christian culture. The Lancelot portion of the cycle, comprising nearly 2/3 of the total narrative, presents the most psychologically complex treatment of the tragic love triangle between Arthur, Guinevere, and Lancelot that medieval literature produced. The anonymous author demonstrates unprecedented skill in analysing the emotional and moral dimensions of adultery within the context of feudal loyalty and Christian marriage doctrine. Unlike earlier treatments that either condemned or celebrated courtly love, the Vulgate Lancelot presents a nuanced exploration of how genuine affection and sexual desire can conflict with social obligations and religious principles without reducing any of the participants to simple moral categories. Lancelot's character development throughout the vast narrative reveals sophisticated understanding of psychological complexity and moral ambiguity that distinguishes the Vulgate cycle from earlier Arthurian literature. The author traces his evolution from an idealistic young knight seeking to prove his worthiness through chivalric achievement to a mature warrior whose extraordinary abilities are compromised by his inability to reconcile his devotion to Guinevere with his loyalty to Arthur. The internal conflicts that torment Lancelot reflect broader tensions within medieval aristocratic culture between individual desire and social responsibility, personal fulfillment and institutional obligation. The prose format allows for detailed exploration of Lancelot's thought processes during crucial moments of moral choice, revealing the psychological mechanisms through which he justifies his adultery while maintaining his commitment to chivalric ideals. The author demonstrates how Lancelot's exceptional martial abilities and genuine dedication to justice enable him to function effectively as Arthur's premier knight, despite the fundamental contradiction between his public role and private behaviour. This psychological realism transforms what could have been a simple tale of sexual transgression into a profound meditation on the nature of moral compromise and the limits of human virtue. Guinevere's characterization in the Vulgate cycle presents her as a fully realized individual whose emotional and intellectual complexity matches that of the male protagonists. Unlike earlier versions that portrayed her primarily as an object of desire or a symbol of feminine perfection, the Vulgate author develops her as a character whose own moral struggles and psychological conflicts drive significant portions of the narrative. Her relationship with Lancelot involves genuine intellectual and emotional compatibility that transcends mere physical attraction, while her position as Arthur's queen requires her to navigate complex political and social obligations that often conflict with her personal inclinations. The author's treatment of Guinevere's moral agency reveals sophisticated understanding of the constraints that medieval marriage customs placed upon aristocratic women, while acknowledging their capacity for independent moral judgment and emotional autonomy. Her decision to enter into an adulterous relationship with Lancelot results from careful consideration of competing loyalties and desires, rather than simple weakness or moral failure. The psychological authenticity of her internal conflicts regarding duty, love, and personal fulfillment creates one of the most compelling female characters in medieval literature. Arthur's position within the love triangle demonstrates the Vulgate author's skill in balancing sympathetic characterization with the demands of tragic narrative structure. The king's gradual awareness of his wife's adultery and his best knight's betrayal creates dramatic tension that builds throughout hundreds of pages of narrative development. Arthur's response to this knowledge reveals the author's deep understanding of the political and personal constraints that limited medieval rulers' options when confronting challenges to their authority that originated within their own households. The prose format enables detailed exploration of Arthur's psychological state as he struggles to balance his roles as husband, king, and feudal lord, while confronting evidence of betrayal by the two people he most trusts and depends upon. His attempts to maintain the public dignity and political stability while dealing with private anguish and personal betrayal demonstrate the author's sophisticated appreciation for the emotional costs of political leadership. The gradual deterioration of Arthur's relationships with both Guinevere and Lancelot provides the psychological foundation for the kingdom's eventual collapse. The moral implications of the central love triangle extend beyond the personal relationships of the three protagonists to encompass broader questions about the nature of loyalty, the limits of forgiveness, and the relationship between private virtue and public responsibility. The vulgar author avoids simple moral judgments by demonstrating how each character's actions result from understandable motivations and legitimate concerns, even when those actions ultimately contribute to tragic consequences. This moral complexity reflects the intellectual sophistication of early 13th century scholastic theology, which emphasized the importance of understanding intention and circumstance in evaluating moral behavior. The theological dimensions of the love triangle become particularly apparent when the narrative is considered alongside the quest del San Graal, where Lancelot's adultery prevents him from achieving the spiritual perfection necessary for Grail vision. The contrast between Lancelot's worldly excellence and spiritual failure illustrates the tension between chivalric achievement and Christian perfection that characterized medieval attempts to synthesize secular and religious values. The author's treatment of this theme demonstrates how personal moral choices can have cosmic significance within a Christian worldview that sees individual salvation as connected to universal redemption. The Mortar II, the final section of the Vulgate cycle, presents the kingdom's downfall as the inevitable result of internal corruption and betrayal, rather than external conquest or natural disaster. The author's analysis of political collapse reveals sophisticated understanding of how personal relationships and individual moral choices can undermine institutional stability and social order. The gradual disintegration of the Round Table Fellowship results from accumulated resentments, competing loyalties, and moral compromises that eventually make peaceful coexistence impossible despite the genuine affection and mutual respect that originally bound the knights together. The prose narrative allows for detailed examination of the political and social mechanisms through which the Arthurian kingdom destroys itself from within. The author traces how Mordred's rebellion gained support not through external military pressure, but through exploitation of existing divisions and grievances within Arthur's court. The knights who support Mordred do so not from simple malice or ambition, but from legitimate concerns about justice, loyalty, and political stability that the king's compromised position makes him unable to address effectively. The Battle of Camlan, as presented in the Mortar II, represents more than a simple military defeat, but rather the culmination of moral and political failures that have been developing throughout the entire cycle. The author's description of the battle emphasizes its fratricidal nature, with former companions and allies fighting against each other in a conflict that destroys the very values and relationships that had originally made Arthur's kingdom worth defending. The mutual destruction of Arthur and Mordred symbolizes the self-defeating nature of internal conflict within any political community. The prose format enables the author to provide detailed analysis of the psychological and emotional states of the various participants in the final catastrophe, revealing how individual choices and personal relationships contribute to collective disaster. The knights who survive the battle do so not through superior virtue or military skill, but through chance and circumstance, emphasizing the random and destructive nature of civil conflict. The author's treatment of the battle's aftermath demonstrates sophisticated understanding of how political collapse affects ordinary people whose lives depend upon institutional stability and social order. The theme of betrayal that runs throughout the Mortar II reflects broader medieval concerns about the fragility of feudal bonds and the difficulty of maintaining loyalty within complex hierarchical relationships. The author examines various forms of betrayal, sexual, political, and personal, while demonstrating how each type undermines different aspects of social stability and moral order. The interconnected nature of these betrayals illustrates how individual moral failures can cascade through social networks to produce consequences far beyond their immediate scope. The prose narrative's psychological depth allows for exploration of the motivations and justifications that lead various characters to betray their oaths and obligations. The author avoids presenting betrayal as simple moral evil by demonstrating how competing loyalties and conflicting obligations can create situations where any choice involves some form of betrayal. This moral complexity reflects the actual challenges faced by medieval nobles, whose multiple feudal relationships often created conflicting demands that could not be simultaneously satisfied. The role of fortune and fate in the Mortar II reveals the influence of classical tragedy and Christian providence doctrine on the Vulgate author's understanding of historical causation. The narrative presents Arthur's downfall as both the inevitable result of human choices and the fulfillment of prophetic predictions that have been established throughout the earlier portions of the cycle. This dual causation, human agency and divine providence, reflects sophisticated theological understanding of how individual moral responsibility operates within God's eternal plan for human history. The detailed character development that prose format enables transforms the major figures of Arthurian legend from archetypal heroes into psychologically realistic individuals whose virtues and flaws reflect the complexity of actual human nature. The author's skill in creating believable dialogue, internal monologue, and behavioural patterns that remain consistent across thousands of pages of narrative demonstrates unprecedented literary sophistication. The characters' relationships evolve and develop in response to changing circumstances while maintaining psychological authenticity that allows readers to understand their motivations and empathise with their struggles. The influence of contemporary legal and political developments on the Vulgate cycle's treatment of feudal relationships, marriage law, and royal authority reveals how medieval literature served as a vehicle for exploring current social issues through historical and legendary material. The author's detailed knowledge of legal procedures, administrative practices, and diplomatic protocols suggests familiarity with actual governmental operations rather than purely literary sources. The narrative's treatment of justice, law enforcement, and political legitimacy reflects ongoing debates within 13th century French society about the proper limits of royal power and the rights of feudal vassals. The manuscript tradition of the Vulgate cycle demonstrates the work's immediate popularity and cultural influence, with copies appearing throughout Europe within decades of its composition. The extensive programme of illumination that accompanies many manuscripts indicates that medieval readers valued the work not merely as entertainment, but as serious literature worthy of artistic enhancement and careful preservation. The cycle's influence on subsequent Arthurian literature was so profound that most later medieval treatments of Arthurian themes drew upon its narrative structure, character development, and thematic concerns rather than returning to earlier sources. The emergence of Sir Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur during the turbulent final decades of the 15th century marked the transformation of continental French Romance tradition into distinctly English literary expression, creating what would become the definitive version of Arthurian legend for English-speaking audiences across the subsequent 5 centuries. Completed around 1470, during Malory's imprisonment in Newgate Prison, this monumental work synthesized nearly 3 centuries of French prose romance into a unified English narrative that preserved the essential elements of earlier traditions while adapting them to reflect the political realities, social values, and cultural concerns of late medieval England. Malory's achievement lay not merely in translation or compilation, but in his ability to reimagine the entire Arthurian corpus through the lens of English chivalric culture, creating a work that functioned simultaneously as nostalgic celebration of an idealized feudal past and implicit commentary on the political chaos of his own era. The historical context surrounding Malory's composition reveals the profound influence that contemporary political upheaval exerted upon his treatment of Arthurian themes. Writing during the Wars of the Roses, when competing dynastic claims had plunged England into decades of civil conflict that destroyed established patterns of feudal loyalty and social stability, Malory addressed an audience intimately familiar with the consequences of political fragmentation and baronial warfare. His presentation of Arthur's reign as a golden age of unified royal authority and chivalric fellowship offered both escapist fantasy and implicit criticism of contemporary political failures, while his detailed exploration of the kingdom's eventual collapse through internal betrayal and civil war provided a mirror for his own era's tragic experiences. Malory's personal background as a member of the Warwickshire gentry who had participated in both military campaigns and criminal activities provided him with practical knowledge of warfare, feudal relationships, and legal procedures that informed his adaptation of French Romance materials. His experience as a knight, landowner, and prisoner gave him intimate understanding of the social and political dynamics that governed late medieval English society, enabling him to transform the courtly idealism of French sources into narratives that reflected the harsh realities of 15th century political life. The tension between chivalric ideals and practical necessity that characterises much of Le Morte d'Arthur derives from Malory's own experience of a society where traditional feudal bonds had been compromised by political opportunism and military expediency. The sources that Malory employed in constructing his massive narrative demonstrate his sophisticated understanding of the full range of Arthurian literary tradition, from the earliest Welsh materials through the most recent French prose cycles. His primary dependence upon the Vulgate cycle and its post-Vulgate continuation provided him with comprehensive narrative frameworks that he modified and adapted, rather than simply translated. The Suite du Merlin, the French prose Tristan, and various other continental sources supplied additional episodes and character developments that Malory integrated into his overall structure through careful editing and selective adaptation. His occasional use of English alliterative poetry, particularly the Mortartura, demonstrates his familiarity with native English literary traditions and his deliberate choice to synthesize continental and insular approaches to Arthurian material. Malory's treatment of his sources reveals consistent editorial principles that transformed French courtly romance into English chivalric narrative through systematic emphasis on martial prowess, feudal loyalty, and practical governance rather than courtly love, psychological analysis, and mystical experience. Where French sources devoted extensive attention to the emotional and spiritual dimensions of knightly adventure, Malory typically condensed or eliminated such material in favour of detailed descriptions of combat techniques, military strategy, and political manoeuvring. His knights demonstrate their worth primarily through battlefield achievement and loyal service rather than through courtly sophistication or mystical insight, reflecting English aristocratic values that emphasise practical competence and military effectiveness over continental ideals of refined behaviour and emotional sensitivity. The structural modifications that Malory imposed upon his source materials created a narrative organisation that emphasised episodic adventure and individual achievement rather than the complex psychological development and thematic unity that characterised the French prose cycles. His division of the work into distinct books focusing on specific knights or narrative episodes allowed readers to approach the material selectively while maintaining overall coherence through recurring characters and interconnected plot developments. This episodic structure reflected both the practical constraints of manuscript production and the preferences of English audiences who valued individual heroic achievement over sustained exploration of complex themes. Malory's characterization of Arthur himself reveals fundamental differences between English and French approaches to royal authority and political leadership. Where French sources often presented Arthur as a somewhat passive figure whose court provided the setting for his knights' adventures, Malory's Arthur functions as an active military commander and political ruler whose personal qualities directly influence his kingdom's success or failure. The English Arthur leads his armies in battle, makes strategic decisions that affect the course of military campaigns, and demonstrates the kind of hands-on leadership that late medieval English audiences expected from their monarchs. This transformation reflects both Malory's personal experience of English royal authority and his audience's familiarity with kings, who are expected to provide active military and political leadership rather than merely ceremonial presence. The emphasis on fellowship that distinguishes Malory's treatment of the Round Table reflects distinctly English concepts of social organisation and political loyalty that differed significantly from continental feudal relationships. Malory's knights function as a brotherhood bound together by personal affection, mutual respect, and shared commitment to common ideals rather than merely formal feudal obligations or courtly etiquette. The repeated emphasis on the knights' love for one another and their grief at separation or death creates an emotional intensity that transforms the Round Table from a political institution into a family unit whose members' relationships transcend conventional hierarchical boundaries. This concept of chivalric fellowship draws upon English military traditions that emphasise the importance of personal bonds between commanders and their followers in maintaining unit cohesion and fighting effectiveness. Malory's detailed descriptions of how the knights support one another during combat, share information about enemies and obstacles, and coordinate their efforts to achieve common goals reflect practical military experience rather than literary convention. The breakdown of this fellowship through jealousy, competition, and conflicting loyalties provides the psychological foundation for the kingdom's eventual collapse, suggesting that political stability depends upon maintaining personal relationships as much as institutional structures. Malory's treatment of honour as the central organising principle of chivalric culture reveals sophisticated understanding of how reputation and social recognition functioned within late medieval aristocratic society. His knights pursue honour through military achievement, loyal service, and adherence to codes of conduct that emphasise courage, honesty, and protection of the weak, rather than through courtly sophistication or romantic conquest. The detailed attention that Malory devotes to questions of precedence, recognition, and public acknowledgement of achievement reflects the importance that English aristocratic culture placed upon maintaining social hierarchy through demonstrated merit rather than inherited status alone. The concept of tragic nobility that pervades Le Morte d'Arthur transforms the inevitable destruction of Arthur's kingdom from simple political failure into a meditation on the transient nature of human achievement and the impossibility of maintaining ideal communities within a fallen world. Malory's knights achieve greatness through their commitment to chivalric ideals, while simultaneously ensuring their own destruction through the very virtues that distinguish them from ordinary men. Lancelot's perfect knighthood makes him Arthur's most valuable ally and most dangerous threat, while Gawain's loyalty to his family ultimately conflicts with his loyalty to his king, creating tragic situations where virtue itself becomes the source of conflict and destruction. This tragic vision reflects both classical literary influences and Christian theological understanding of human nature and divine providence, but Malory's treatment emphasises the heroic dignity that can be achieved even within circumstances that ensure ultimate failure. His knights face their destinies with courage and determination that transforms defeat into moral victory, while their commitment to ideals that transcend immediate self-interest provides meaning that survives the collapse of the institutions they served. The elegiac tone that characterises much of the work reflects Malory's own experience of a society where traditional values and relationships were being destroyed by political change and social transformation. The religious dimensions of Malory's narrative reveal complex attitudes toward the relationship between secular chivalry and Christian spirituality that differed significantly from the explicit theological focus of earlier Grail literature. While Malory preserves the basic structure of the Grail quest and acknowledges the spiritual superiority of Galahad's achievement, His treatment emphasizes the tragic exclusion of worldly knights from mystical experience rather than celebrating the triumph of contemplative perfection over secular concerns. Lancelot's failure to achieve complete Grail vision becomes a source of pathos rather than moral condemnation, while the departure of Galahad and Percival leaves the earthly realm diminished rather than purified. This modification of French spiritual themes reflects English religious culture that valued practical Christian virtue and active charitable work over contemplative withdrawal and mystical experience. Malory's knights demonstrate their Christian commitment through protection of the innocent, defence of the church, and maintenance of justice rather than through ascetic discipline or theological sophistication. The integration of Christian and chivalric values occurs through practical application rather than theoretical synthesis, creating a religious vision that emphasizes moral behavior and social responsibility over doctrinal understanding or mystical achievement. William Caxton's decision to publish Le Morte d'Arthur in 1485 reflected both commercial calculation and cultural mission, as England's first printer recognised the work's potential to satisfy popular demand for vernacular literature, while establishing English literary tradition as worthy of comparison with continental achievements. Caxton's preface reveals his understanding of the work's significance as both entertainment and moral instruction, emphasising its value in teaching proper chivalric behaviour while acknowledging its appeal as adventurous narrative. The timing of publication, coinciding with Henry Tudor's victory at Bosworth Field and the establishment of a new dynasty, provided political context that enhanced the work's relevance as a meditation on royal authority, dynastic legitimacy, and national unity. The editorial decisions that Caxton made in preparing Malory's text for publication reveal sophisticated understanding of his intended audience and their literary expectations. His division of the work into 21 books with descriptive chapter headings created a structure that facilitated selective reading while maintaining narrative coherence. The modernisation of spelling and grammar made the text accessible to contemporary readers while preserving the essential character of Malory's prose style. These modifications transformed a manuscript work designed for aristocratic readers into a printed book that could reach broad audiences while maintaining literary quality and cultural authority. The immediate impact of Caxton's publication established Le Morte d'Arthur as the standard English version of Arthurian legend, influencing subsequent literary treatments and popular understanding of the material for centuries to come. The work's availability in printed form enabled widespread circulation that manuscript tradition could never have achieved, while Caxton's commercial success demonstrated the existence of substantial English demand for vernacular literature that combined entertainment value with cultural prestige. The standardization of Arthurian narrative that resulted from the work's dominance created a shared cultural reference point that influenced English literary development across multiple genres and historical periods. The linguistic achievement of Malory's prose style created a distinctly English literary voice that successfully adapted French narrative techniques to native linguistic patterns and cultural preferences. His syntax combines the periodic complexity of Latin prose with the directness and clarity of English vernacular expression, creating sentences that possess both dignity and accessibility. The vocabulary draws upon both Norman French and Anglo-Saxon roots to create a linguistic register that was simultaneously elevated and comprehensible, establishing stylistic standards that influenced English prose development throughout the early modern period. Malory's dialogue reveals particular skill in creating speech patterns that distinguish individual characters while maintaining consistency with overall narrative tone. His knights speak with dignity and formality appropriate to their social status, while revealing personality traits and emotional states through word choice and rhetorical patterns. The integration of direct speech with narrative description creates dramatic scenes that engage readers' attention while advancing plot development and character revelation. This technical achievement demonstrates Mallory's mastery of prose composition and his understanding of how linguistic choices can enhance narrative effectiveness. The manuscript evidence for Le Morte d'Arthur reveals the complex relationship between Mallory's original composition and Caxton's published version, with the discovery of the Winchester manuscript in 1934 providing insight into editorial choices that shaped the work's transmission and reception. Comparison between manuscript and printed versions demonstrates how Caxton's modifications affected the work's structure, emphasis, and cultural significance while preserving its essential character and literary achievement. The textual variations illuminate both the creative process through which Mallory transformed his sources and the editorial decisions through which Caxton adapted manuscript tradition to print culture requirements. The dissemination of Arthurian romance across medieval Europe created a fascinating tapestry of cultural adaptation, as each region transformed the fundamental narratives to reflect local values, political concerns, and literary traditions. While French courtly romance had established the basic framework of Arthurian literature, German, Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese authors approached this material with distinctly different perspectives that revealed the remarkable flexibility of the legendary corpus. These adaptations demonstrate how medieval literary culture functioned as an international phenomenon, while simultaneously serving specific regional and national interests. German Arthurian literature emerged during the height of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, when the Holy Roman Empire's cultural confidence and political ambitions created an intellectual environment receptive to sophisticated vernacular poetry. The German approach to Arthurian material emphasized philosophical depth, psychological complexity, and theological sophistication that often exceeded their French sources in intellectual rigor. German poets possessed extensive education in classical literature, scholastic theology, and contemporary philosophy, enabling them to transform adventure narratives into profound meditations on fundamental questions of human existence, divine providence, and moral responsibility. Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parzival, composed between 1200 and 1210, represents the most ambitious and intellectually sophisticated treatment of Grail material in medieval literature. Wolfram claimed to base his work on a mysterious source attributed to one Cure de Provence, though modern scholarship suggests this attribution may have been a literary fiction designed to provide authority for his extensive modifications of Chrétien's Perceval. Regardless of his actual sources, Wolfram created a work that far exceeded its French predecessor in scope, complexity, and philosophical depth, transforming a relatively straightforward quest narrative into an encyclopedic exploration of medieval culture, theology, and human psychology. The opening books of Parzival introduce Gahmuret, the hero's father, whose adventures in the Orient establish themes of cultural encounter, religious difference, and moral complexity that will dominate the entire work. Gahmuret's marriage to the Black Queen Bella Khan in North Africa and his subsequent abandonment of her to marry Herzeloid in Wales create a pattern of cross-cultural relationships and conflicted loyalties that reflects the international scope of medieval aristocratic culture. Wolfram's detailed descriptions of Islamic civilization, military technology, and religious practices demonstrate remarkable knowledge of contemporary Middle Eastern culture acquired through crusading contacts and diplomatic exchanges. The characterization of Feyrefiz, Parzival's half-brother, who is born of Gahmuret's union with Belakane, represents one of the most sophisticated treatments of racial and religious difference in medieval literature. Wolfram describes Feyrefiz as a warrior whose skin displays a pattern of black and white patches, creating a visual symbol of cultural hybridity that challenges contemporary assumptions about racial categories and religious identity. Feyrefiz's eventual conversion to Christianity and marriage to the Grail Maiden demonstrates Wolfram's vision of universal salvation that transcends ethnic and cultural boundaries while acknowledging the reality of religious differences. Wolfram's treatment of Parzival's education and moral development reveals profound understanding of pedagogical theory and psychological growth that draws upon contemporary scholastic discussions of human nature and moral formation. The young knight's initial ignorance and social awkwardness result from his mother's well-intentioned but misguided attempt to protect him from the violent world of chivalry by raising him in isolation from courtly culture. This educational experiment fails catastrophically when Parzival encounters knights for the first time and immediately abandons his mother to seek his fortune at Arthur's court, demonstrating the impossibility of avoiding one's destined social role through protective isolation. The Red Knight episode, where Parzival kills Uther and appropriates his armour without understanding the moral implications of his actions, illustrates Wolfram's sophisticated analysis of how moral knowledge develops through experience and reflection rather than simple instruction. Parzival's technical mastery of knightly skills proceeds much more rapidly than his understanding of chivalric ethics, creating a dangerous gap between capability and wisdom that characterizes much of his early career. Wolfram's detailed exploration of this moral development process reflects contemporary educational theory that emphasized the importance of practical experience in developing ethical judgment. Gurnemantz's instruction of Parzival in proper knightly behaviour introduces themes of mentorship, social responsibility, and the transmission of cultural values that resonate throughout the work. The older knight's advice regarding appropriate conduct toward women, proper behaviour in combat, and the importance of asking questions when confronted with mysterious circumstances provides Parzival with crucial knowledge that he fails to apply correctly during his first visit to the Grail Castle. This failure demonstrates how formal instruction must be supplemented by practical wisdom and moral sensitivity that can only develop through actual experience of complex ethical situations. The Grail Castle episode in Wolfram's version differs significantly from Chrétien's treatment through its detailed description of the Grail ceremony, the nature of the Grail itself, and the theological significance of the mysterious ritual. Wolfram's Grail appears as a stone called lapsit exilis that provides miraculous sustenance and possesses the power to grant eternal youth to those who serve it faithfully. This transformation of Chrétien's cup into a stone reflects Wolfram's synthesis of Celtic magical traditions with alchemical symbolism and Christian sacramental theology, creating a complex symbol that operates simultaneously on multiple interpretative levels. The Grail community that Wolfram describes functions as a military religious order, similar to the contemporary Knights Templar, with members bound by vows of chastity, poverty, and service to the Grail's mysterious purposes. The knights and maidens who serve the Grail receive their calling through divine inscription that appears on the stone itself, creating a system of religious vocation that bypasses conventional ecclesiastical hierarchy while maintaining strict standards of moral purity and spiritual dedication. This institutional structure reflects contemporary debates about religious authority and the relationship between mystical experience and institutional control. Wolfram's treatment of the Grail kingship reveals sophisticated understanding of medieval political theory and the theological foundations of royal authority. The Grail King serves not through hereditary succession or popular election, but through divine designation that can only be fulfilled by individuals who possess both martial prowess and spiritual purity. The king's role combines military leadership, priestly functions, and mystical communion with divine will, creating a model of sacred kingship that transcends conventional distinctions between secular and religious authority. The parallel narrative of Gawain's adventures provides contrast to Parzival's spiritual quest, while exploring different aspects of chivalric culture and social responsibility. Gawain represents the ideal of courtly knighthood that emphasizes social grace, diplomatic skill, and service to ladies rather than spiritual enlightenment or mystical experience. His adventures typically involve rescuing damsels in distress, resolving feudal disputes, and maintaining the social order that enables civilized life to flourish. These episodes demonstrate Wolfram's appreciation for the practical virtues that sustain medieval society, while acknowledging their limitations when confronted with ultimate spiritual questions. The conclusion of Parzival achieves a synthesis of spiritual and worldly concerns that reflects Wolfram's vision of integrated Christian life. Parzival's successful completion of the Grail quest does not require him to abandon his marriage to Condoramus or his responsibilities as a secular ruler, but rather enables him to fulfill these worldly obligations more effectively through the spiritual insight he has gained. This integration of contemplative achievement with active engagement in social and political life represents a distinctly German approach to the relationship between religious and secular values. Gottfried von Strasberg's Tristan, composed around 1210, represents the most sophisticated and psychologically complex treatment of the Tristan and Isolde legend in medieval literature. Gottfried's approach to this tragic love story emphasizes the irreconcilable conflict between passion and social duty, individual desire and collective responsibility, in ways that anticipate later developments in European literary psychology. His detailed analysis of the lovers' emotional states, their attempts to rationalize their adultery, and their ultimate acceptance of love's destructive power creates one of the most profound explorations of human passion in medieval literature. Gottfried's treatment of the love potion episode transforms what earlier versions presented as magical compulsion into a symbol of the overwhelming power of genuine passion that transcends rational control and social convention. The potion serves not as an excuse for the lover's behaviour, but as a metaphor for the transformative experience of absolute love that renders conventional moral categories irrelevant. Gottfried's detailed description of how the potion affects Tristan and Isolde emphasizes their conscious choice to embrace a love they know will destroy them, rather than presenting them as helpless victims of supernatural forces. The Cave of Lovers episode, where Tristan and Isolde retreat from court society to live in perfect union with each other and nature, represents Gottfried's vision of love as an alternative form of religious experience that provides access to transcendent reality through human relationship rather than divine grace. The allegorical description of the cave's architecture and furnishings creates a temple of love that parallels contemporary descriptions of religious sanctuaries, while substituting erotic devotion for conventional piety. This theological audacity reflects the intellectual sophistication of German court culture and its willingness to explore radical alternatives to established religious orthodoxy. Gottfried's incomplete narrative breaks off before reaching the lovers' deaths, creating interpretive challenges that have generated scholarly debate for centuries. The author's comments about his sources and his criticism of other poets' treatments of the Tristan material reveal sophisticated literary consciousness and awareness of different interpretive possibilities within the legendary tradition. His emphasis on the tragic nobility of the lover's commitment to absolute passion, regardless of its social consequences, establishes themes that would influence European literature for centuries. Italian Arthurian literature developed within the unique political and cultural environment of the medieval Italian city-states, where republican traditions, commercial prosperity, and classical heritage created literary preferences that differed significantly from the feudal cultures of Northern Europe. Italian authors approached Arthurian material with particular interest in political organisation, legal procedures, and social mobility that reflected their own urban experiences. The transformation of chivalric romance into Italian vernacular literature involved systematic adaptation of feudal themes to address the concerns of merchant patricians and professional classes who constituted the primary audience for vernacular literature in medieval Italy. The Tavola Rotonda, composed during the late 13th or early 14th century, represents the most comprehensive Italian adaptation of Arthurian material, synthesizing French prose romance traditions with distinctly Italian narrative preferences and cultural values. This massive compilation demonstrates sophisticated understanding of the entire range of Arthurian literature, while adapting it to reflect Italian political ideals and social structures. The anonymous author's treatment of Arthur's court emphasizes legal procedures, administrative efficiency, and diplomatic negotiations rather than military conquest or mystical experience, creating a vision of ideal governance that appealed to Italian urban audiences familiar with complex political institutions. The Italian approach to the Round Table Fellowship reveals particular interest in questions of merit, social advancement, and institutional reform that reflected contemporary Italian political discourse. Italian versions typically emphasize the possibility of achieving knightly status through demonstrated virtue and exceptional achievement rather than inherited nobility, creating narratives that appeal to audiences whose own social mobility depended upon commercial success and professional competence. The detailed attention to legal procedures, judicial processes, and administrative structures in Italian Arthurian literature reflects the sophisticated governmental institutions that characterized medieval Italian city-states. Italian treatments of courtly love reveal significant modifications of French romantic conventions to accommodate different social structures and cultural values. Italian authors typically emphasize the intellectual and spiritual dimensions of love relationships while reducing the emphasis on adulterous passion that characterizes French Romance tradition. This modification reflects both the influence of contemporary Italian religious movements and the practical concerns of urban families whose marriage arrangements served important commercial and political functions that could not be compromised by romantic idealization of adultery. The geographical settings of Italian Arthurian romance demonstrate systematic adaptation of Celtic and French materials to Mediterranean environments and cultural contexts. Italian authors typically relocate adventures to familiar Italian landscapes, while incorporating references to contemporary political events and social conditions. This geographical translation enables Italian audiences to identify with Arthurian characters while maintaining the sense of exotic adventure that distinguish Romance literature from purely realistic narrative. Spanish and Portuguese Arthurian literature emerged within the context of the Reconquista, where Christian kingdoms were engaged in centuries-long military campaigns against Islamic territories in the Iberian Peninsula. This political situation created cultural preferences for military adventure, religious crusading, and territorial expansion that influenced how Iberian authors adapted Arthurian material. The transformation of chivalric romance into Spanish and Portuguese vernacular literature involved systematic emphasis on religious warfare, cultural conflict, and territorial conquest that reflected contemporary political realities. The Spanish Demanda del Santo Grial represents a significant adaptation of French Grail material that emphasizes the crusading dimensions of the quest, while reducing the mystical and contemplative elements that characterize French versions. Spanish authors typically present the Grail quest as a military campaign against paganism and heresy, rather than a spiritual journey toward mystical union with divine will. This transformation reflects the influence of contemporary Spanish religious culture, where military service against Islamic kingdoms was considered a form of religious devotion equivalent to monastic vocation. Portuguese Arthurian literature reveals particular interest in maritime adventure and overseas exploration that anticipates later Portuguese achievements in Atlantic navigation and colonial expansion. Portuguese versions of Arthurian material frequently include episodes involving sea voyages, island adventures, and encounters with exotic peoples that reflect contemporary Portuguese involvement in Mediterranean trade and North African expeditions. These modifications demonstrate how Arthurian literature could be adapted to reflect specific regional interests and cultural priorities. The treatment of religious themes in Iberian Arthurian literature reveals the profound influence of contemporary Spanish and Portuguese religious culture, where mystical theology, crusading ideology, and popular devotion created distinctive approaches to questions of salvation, divine grace, and religious authority. Iberian authors typically emphasize the importance of Orthodox Christian belief and practice, while reducing the theological complexity and interpretive ambiguity that characterizes French Grail literature. This simplification reflects both the educational background of Iberian audiences and the political necessity of maintaining religious unity during periods of military conflict with Islamic kingdoms. The linguistic development of Arthurian literature in various European vernaculars demonstrates the crucial role that translation and adaptation played in establishing national literary traditions during the medieval period. The process of transforming French source materials into German, Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese required systematic development of vernacular vocabulary, narrative techniques, and literary conventions that would influence subsequent literary development in each linguistic tradition. The success of these adaptations established Arthurian material as a crucial component of emerging European national literatures, while demonstrating the international character of medieval literary culture. The quest to identify the historical Arthur has consumed scholars for over a century, transforming from romantic antiquarianism into rigorous archaeological and textual investigation that seeks to separate demonstrable historical evidence from centuries of literary embellishment. Modern scholarship approaches this challenge through multiple methodologies, combining archaeological excavation, linguistic analysis, and careful examination of contemporary sources to reconstruct the political and military realities of post-Roman Britain. The search for Arthur requires navigating between the extremes of uncritical acceptance of medieval sources and wholesale dismissal of their historical value, recognizing that legendary material often preserves authentic memories of real events and individuals, while transforming them beyond easy recognition. Archaeological investigation has revolutionized our understanding of post-Roman Britain by providing material evidence that can be independently dated and analysed without reliance upon potentially compromised textual sources. Excavations at sites traditionally associated with Arthur have revealed complex patterns of reoccupation, fortification, and material culture that correspond to the historical period when a figure like Arthur might have operated. The physical evidence demonstrates that certain locations experienced significant military and political activity during the late 5th and early 6th centuries, supporting the possibility that organised resistance leaders coordinated defensive efforts across multiple regions. The refortification of Iron Age hill forts during the post-Roman period represents one of the most significant archaeological discoveries relevant to Arthurian studies. Sites like Cadbury Castle in Somerset, Dinas Powys in Wales, and Dunad in Scotland show evidence of substantial reconstruction during the late 5th and early 6th centuries, involving the construction of timber-framed ramparts, improved gate systems, and internal buildings capable of housing significant populations. The scale and sophistication of these defensive works required coordinated planning, substantial labour forces, and access to both material resources and engineering expertise that suggest the involvement of powerful political leaders. Cadbury Castle, long identified in local tradition as Camelot, provides particularly compelling evidence of high-status occupation during the Arthurian period. Archaeological excavations conducted between 1966 and 1970 revealed a massive timber hall measuring approximately 60 by 30 feet, constructed within the innermost defensive circuit of the hill fort. The building's size and architectural sophistication indicate that it served as the residence of a powerful lord capable of maintaining a substantial retinue and exercising authority over extensive territories. Associated finds include Mediterranean pottery, fine metalwork, and evidence of specialised craft production that demonstrates the occupants' wealth and international connections. The defensive modifications at Cadbury Castle during this period involved the construction of a timber-framed rampart reinforced with stone blocks and fronted by a vertical timber palisade. This defensive system combined Celtic hill fort construction techniques with Roman military engineering principles, suggesting that the builders possessed knowledge of both traditions. The gate complex included a sophisticated entrance system with multiple defensive barriers designed to channel attackers into killing zones where defenders could concentrate their fire. These modifications indicate that the site's occupants faced serious military threats and possessed the resources and expertise necessary to implement effective countermeasures. Material culture from Cadbury Castle reveals connections to both Mediterranean trade networks and local British production systems that illuminate the economic and political context of post-Roman leadership. Imported pottery from the Eastern Mediterranean, North African red slipware and wine amphorae demonstrate that the site's occupants maintained commercial relationships with distant regions despite the political fragmentation of post-Roman Europe. Local metalworking evidence includes iron slag, bronze-working debris, and fragments of high-quality weapons and jewellery that indicate on-site production of military equipment and prestige goods. The chronological evidence from Cadbury Castle places the major refortification and occupation phases precisely within the period when historical sources locate Arthur's career. Radiocarbon dating and pottery analysis indicate intensive occupation between approximately 470 and 580 AD, corresponding to the traditional dates for Arthur's military campaigns and the Battle of Badon Hill. The abandonment of the site during the late 6th century coincides with historical evidence for the collapse of organised British resistance and the resumption of Saxon territorial expansion. Dinas Powys in South Wales provides additional archaeological evidence for high-status occupation during the post-Roman period, with excavations revealing a fortified enclosure containing buildings, workshops, and defensive structures dated to the 5th and 6th centuries. The site's material culture includes imported Mediterranean pottery, fine metalwork, and evidence of specialised craft production, similar to that found at Cadbury Castle. The defensive arrangements include a stone-built rampart with timber reinforcement and a complex entrance system designed to control access to the interior. The scale and sophistication of these fortifications indicate that the site served as the stronghold of a powerful regional leader. The distribution of similar fortified sites across Wales, Cornwall, and southwestern England reveals a pattern of coordinated defensive activity that suggests unified military planning and political cooperation between previously independent kingdoms. The simultaneous reoccupation of multiple hill forts during the late 5th century indicates a systematic response to Saxon expansion that required central coordination and resource allocation. This archaeological evidence supports historical accounts of organised British resistance under unified command, while providing specific geographical and chronological contexts for such activities. Textual analysis of the earlier sources requires careful attention to the political and cultural contexts in which they were composed, recognising that medieval chroniclers wrote with specific audiences and purposes that influenced their selection and presentation of historical material. Gildas's De Excidio Britanniae, despite its limitations as a historical source, provides contemporary testimony regarding the reality of effective British military resistance during the late 5th century. His description of the Battle of Badon Hill as a decisive victory that provided lasting peace corresponds to archaeological evidence of disrupted Saxon settlement patterns and temporary cessation of territorial expansion during the early 6th century. The geographical references in early sources, when carefully analysed, provide valuable clues about the scope and character of British resistance activities. The battle sites mentioned in Nennius's list span territories from Wales to northern England, suggesting either an extended chronological framework for Arthur's career or coordination between multiple resistance leaders operating in different regions. The emphasis on river-crossing battles indicates tactical situations, where British forces sought to prevent Saxon armies from advancing into defensible terrain, a strategy that would have required detailed knowledge of local geography and Saxon movement patterns. Linguistic evidence from place names and early Welsh poetry provides additional support for the historical existence of figures and events that later became incorporated into Arthurian legend. The survival of Celtic place names in regions that experienced Saxon conquest suggests that local populations maintained cultural continuity and historical memory across periods of political change. Welsh bardic tradition preserved detailed geographical knowledge that corresponds to archaeological evidence of post-Roman military activity, indicating that oral tradition maintained relatively accurate historical information across generations of transmission. The proposed locations for Camelot reflect different interpretative approaches to the relationship between archaeological evidence and literary tradition. Cadbury Castle's identification as Camelot derives primarily from local folklore and antiquarian speculation, rather than medieval sources, but the archaeological evidence for high-status occupation during the Arthurian period provides circumstantial support for the association. The site's strategic location, impressive fortifications, and evidence of wealth and international connections make it a plausible candidate for the stronghold of a powerful post-Roman British leader. Caerleon on Usk in Wales possesses stronger literary credentials as the location of Arthur's court, appearing in Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae and subsequent medieval sources. The site's Roman heritage as the fortress of the Second Augustan Legion provided impressive architectural remains that would have appealed to medieval authors seeking to emphasize Arthur's imperial connections. Archaeological investigation has revealed continued occupation during the post-Roman period, though not on the scale suggested by medieval literary descriptions. The survival of substantial Roman buildings and defensive works would have made Caerleon an attractive location for post-Roman British leaders seeking to emphasize their connection to imperial tradition. Winchester's association with Camelot derives primarily from later medieval tradition and the political needs of Anglo-Norman kings seeking to connect their authority to Arthurian precedent. The Great Hall's Round Table, constructed during the 13th century, represents deliberate political symbolism rather than historical continuity. However, Winchester's importance as a royal centre throughout the medieval period and its strategic location in southern England make it a plausible site for significant political activity during any historical period, including the post-Roman era. The Battle of Baden Hill represents the most historically significant event associated with Arthur, mentioned by both Gildas and later sources as a decisive British victory that temporarily halted Saxon expansion. The battle's historical importance is confirmed by its effects on subsequent political development, with archaeological evidence supporting a period of Saxon settlement disruption and territorial consolidation during the early 6th century. The identification of Baden's location remains contentious, with proposed sites ranging from Bath in Somerset to Badbury Rings in Dorset, each offering geographical and archaeological evidence that could support the association. Bath's identification as Baden draws upon the linguistic similarity between the Roman name Aquae Sulis and the Welsh Baden, combined with the strategic importance of the site as a crossing point of major Roman roads. The location's defensibility and its position controlling access to the Severn Valley would have made it a natural focus for military campaigns during the post-Roman period. Archaeological evidence from Bath indicates continued occupation during the 5th and 6th centuries, though the scale and character of this occupation remain unclear due to later medieval and modern development. Badbury Rings in Dorset offers a different interpretive possibility, with its massive Iron Age fortifications providing a defensible position that could have served as a base for British forces operating against Saxon settlements in the Thames Valley. The site's location near the boundaries between British and Saxon territories during the late 5th century makes it a plausible location for a major confrontation between competing forces. Archaeological investigation has revealed evidence of post-Roman occupation, though not on the scale that would be expected for a major military stronghold. The character of warfare during the post-Roman period involved tactical innovations that combined Celtic military traditions with Roman organisational principles and equipment. British forces likely emphasised cavalry warfare, drawing upon both Roman cavalry techniques and Celtic horse-breeding expertise that had developed in regions like Wales and northern England. The archaeological evidence for high-quality metalworking at sites like Cadbury Castle suggests that British leaders possessed the resources and technical knowledge necessary to equip their forces with effective weapons and armour. The integration of different military traditions required sophisticated understanding of tactical principles and strategic planning that would have distinguished elite commanders from ordinary war leaders. The coordination of cavalry and infantry formations, the conduct of siege operations, and the maintenance of supply lines across extensive territories demanded skills that could only be developed through extensive military experience and systematic training. The success of British resistance efforts during the late 5th and early 6th centuries indicates that leaders like Arthur possessed these capabilities and could apply them effectively against Saxon military forces. The transformation of historical events into legendary narrative involved systematic modification of factual details to serve literary and cultural purposes, while preserving essential structural elements that maintained connection to original events. The process by which a post-Roman British war leader became the medieval King Arthur illustrates how historical memory operates within oral and written traditions, selectively preserving and transforming information according to the needs and interests of successive generations. Understanding this transformation requires recognizing both the historical kernels within legendary material and the cultural forces that shaped their development into literary tradition. The archaeological and textual evidence, when carefully analysed and correlated, supports the existence of effective British military leadership during the post-Roman period, while acknowledging the impossibility of identifying specific individuals with absolute certainty. The convergence of multiple independent sources of evidence suggests that figures like Ambrosius Aurelianus and possibly Arthur coordinated successful resistance efforts that temporarily preserved British independence in certain regions. The legendary development of these historical figures reflects their genuine importance within post-Roman British culture and their lasting impact on subsequent historical development. The collapse of medieval feudalism and the emergence of Renaissance humanism might have consigned Arthurian legend to historical obscurity, yet the opposite occurred as successive generations discovered new relevance in Arthur's story, adapting it to address contemporary concerns about leadership, national identity and moral purpose. The 16th and 17th centuries witnessed sporadic interest in Arthurian material primarily through antiquarian scholarship and occasional literary references, but the legend's true renaissance began during the late 18th century, when Romantic poets and scholars rediscovered medieval literature as a source of authentic emotion and national heritage. This renewed interest culminated in the Victorian era's comprehensive revival of Arthurian themes, transforming medieval romance into a vehicle for exploring modern anxieties about industrial society, imperial responsibility, and cultural identity. The Victorian Arthurian revival emerged from the intersection of several cultural movements that shaped 19th century British intellectual life. The Gothic revival in architecture and decorative arts created aesthetic preferences that valued medieval craftsmanship and spiritual symbolism over classical restraint and rational design. Simultaneously, the development of medieval studies as an academic discipline provided scholarly apparatus for understanding historical contexts and textual traditions that had been largely ignored since the Renaissance. The combination of romantic sensibility and scholarly rigour enabled Victorian authors to approach Arthurian material with both emotional engagement and intellectual sophistication, creating works that satisfied contemporary literary standards while preserving essential elements of medieval tradition. Political developments during the early Victorian period provided additional motivation for Arthurian revival, as British imperial expansion and domestic social reform created demand for historical precedents that could justify contemporary policies and aspirations. Arthur's legendary empire offered a model of benevolent conquest and civilizing mission that appealed to Victorian audiences seeking to understand their own nation's global responsibilities. The Round Table Fellowship provided an ideal of masculine cooperation and moral purpose that addressed concerns about the dehumanizing effects of industrial capitalism and urban anonymity. These political applications of Arthurian symbolism enabled the legend to function as both escapist fantasy and serious commentary on contemporary social issues. Alfred Tennyson's Idylls of the King, composed intermittently between 1856 and 1885, represents the most ambitious and influential treatment of Arthurian material in modern literature. Tennyson approached the medieval sources with the sensibility of a Victorian moralist, transforming the complex psychological realities of medieval romance into clear allegories of moral conflict and spiritual development. His Arthur embodies Victorian ideals of masculine authority, moral purity, and civilizing mission, while the kingdom's collapse results from the corruption of these ideals through adultery, betrayal, and moral compromise. This interpretation reflected contemporary anxieties about the stability of British society and the moral foundations of imperial authority. The structure of the Idylls reveals Tennyson's sophisticated understanding of both classical literary tradition and contemporary poetic technique. The 12 interconnected poems trace the rise and fall of Arthur's kingdom through carefully selected episodes that emphasize moral themes, rather than military adventure or romantic intrigue. Tennyson's blank verse adapts Miltonic epic tradition to Victorian sensibilities, creating a poetic style that combines classical dignity with emotional accessibility. The detailed descriptions of landscape, architecture, and material culture demonstrate the poet's familiarity with medieval sources, while transforming them to reflect Victorian aesthetic preferences and moral concerns. The coming of Arthur establishes the mystical foundations of royal authority through Tennyson's treatment of Arthur's mysterious origins and divine calling. The poet's description of Arthur's arrival emphasizes his role as a civilizing force who transforms barbarous Britain into an ordered Christian kingdom through the establishment of just laws and moral institutions. Excalibur's emergence from the lake symbolizes the supernatural authorization of legitimate royal power, while the sword's eventual return to the water represents the temporary nature of all earthly authority. This cyclical pattern reflects Tennyson's understanding of historical process as a series of divine interventions that establish and withdraw political legitimacy according to moral criteria. The characterization of Lancelot in the Idylls reveals Tennyson's complex attitude toward the relationship between human excellence and moral failure. Lancelot possesses all the qualities that should make him the perfect knight: physical prowess, courage, loyalty, and dedication to justice. Yet his adultery with Guinevere corrupts these virtues and ultimately destroys the kingdom he serves. Tennyson's psychological analysis of Lancelot's internal conflict between duty and passion demonstrates sophisticated understanding of moral psychology, while serving as a warning about the consequences of personal indulgence for those who hold positions of public responsibility. Lancelot and Elaine explores the tragic consequences of unrequited love through the story of the Lady of Shalot's death, transforming Malory's relatively straightforward narrative into a complex meditation on the relationship between artistic creation, romantic idealization, and social reality. Elaine's devotion to Lancelot represents the destructive power of romantic fantasy when it conflicts with actual human relationships and social obligations. Her death serves as both a critique of romantic excess and a lament for the loss of innocence that, accompanies mature understanding of human complexity and moral ambiguity. The Grail episodes in Tennyson's version eliminate much of the theological complexity found in medieval sources, focusing instead on the contrast between worldly achievement and spiritual aspiration. Galahad represents perfect spiritual purity that transcends earthly concerns, while Percival achieves partial vision through sincere seeking despite moral imperfection. Lancelot's failure to achieve Grail vision results directly from his adultery, creating a clear moral lesson about the incompatibility of spiritual achievement with sexual transgression. This simplified treatment reflects Victorian religious sensibilities that emphasize moral behaviour over theological sophistication. The Holy Grail demonstrates Tennyson's skill in creating atmospheric descriptions that evoke mystical experience while maintaining psychological realism. The various knights' visions of the Grail reflect their individual spiritual capacities and moral conditions, with each vision revealing as much about the seeker as about the sought object. The poem's treatment of religious experience emphasizes personal devotion and moral purity rather than institutional authority or sacramental theology, reflecting contemporary Protestant emphasis on individual relationship with the divine. The final idylls trace the kingdom's collapse through the cumulative effects of moral corruption and political betrayal. The last tournament presents a world where chivalric ideals have been degraded into empty forms and violent competition, while Guinevere explores the queen's recognition of her responsibility for the kingdom's destruction. Tennyson's treatment of these themes reflects Victorian concerns about moral decay and social disintegration, while maintaining hope for eventual renewal through repentance and divine grace. The passing of Arthur achieves genuine tragic grandeur through its depiction of the final battle and Arthur's mysterious departure to Avalon. Tennyson's description of the Battle of Cumlan emphasises its fratricidal nature, with former companions fighting in darkness and confusion that symbolises the moral chaos resulting from the abandonment of shared ideals. Arthur's wound represents not merely physical injury, but spiritual damage that can only be healed through withdrawal from earthly involvement. The ambiguous ending, with Arthur's departure to an uncertain destination, maintains the possibility of return while acknowledging the reality of historical change and loss. The influence of Tennyson's idylls on subsequent Arthurian literature was profound and lasting, establishing interpretive frameworks and thematic concerns that dominated treatments of the material well into the 20th century. The work's emphasis on moral allegory, psychological analysis, and social commentary provided models for later authors seeking to adapt medieval material to modern concerns. The poem's commercial success demonstrated the continuing popular appeal of Arthurian themes, while its critical recognition established the legend's legitimacy as serious literary material worthy of major artistic treatment. The pre-Raphaelite movement's engagement with Arthurian themes created visual interpretations that complemented and influenced literary developments, while establishing iconographic traditions that shaped popular understanding of medieval culture. Artists like Dante Gabriel Rossetti, Edward Burne-Jones, and William Morris approached Arthurian subjects with romantic sensibilities that emphasized emotional intensity, spiritual symbolism, and aesthetic beauty rather than historical accuracy or moral instruction. Their paintings, tapestries, and decorative objects created visual vocabularies for Arthurian themes that influenced subsequent artistic and literary treatments. William Morris's The Defence of Guinevere and Other Poems represents an early attempt to recover the psychological complexity and moral ambiguity of medieval sources, while rejecting Victorian moralizing tendencies. Morris's Guinevere possesses agency and intelligence that enable her to defend her actions through sophisticated analysis of competing loyalties and desires. The poem's dramatic monologue format allows for psychological exploration that reveals the Queen's internal conflicts without reducing them to simple moral categories. This approach influenced later authors seeking to develop more complex and realistic characterizations of Arthurian figures. The 20th century witnessed an explosion of Arthurian literature that reflected the century's political upheavals, technological changes, and evolving cultural values. Authors approached the medieval material with increased historical consciousness and psychological sophistication, while adapting it to address contemporary concerns about war, social change, and individual identity. The development of new literary techniques and theoretical frameworks enabled more complex treatments of Arthurian themes that could accommodate multiple perspectives and interpretive possibilities. T.H. White's The Once and Future King represents the most successful modern adaptation of Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, transforming medieval romance into a comprehensive exploration of political theory, educational philosophy, and human nature. White's tetralogy traces Arthur's development from an ignorant boy into a wise king who understands the tragic limitations of political power and military force. The work's combination of comedy, tragedy, and philosophical reflection creates a complex narrative that appeals to both adult and juvenile audiences while addressing serious questions about justice, authority, and social organisation. White's treatment of Arthur's education under Merlin's guidance provides opportunities for exploring different approaches to learning and moral development. The magical transformations that allow Arthur to experience life as various animals serve didactic purposes by illustrating different forms of social organisation and survival strategies. These episodes demonstrate White's understanding of contemporary anthropological and psychological theories while maintaining the sense of wonder and magical possibility that distinguishes fantasy literature from purely realistic fiction. The characterization of Lancelot in White's version reveals sophisticated psychological analysis that acknowledges the complexity of human motivation while maintaining sympathy for flawed characters. White's Lancelot struggles with self-hatred, religious doubt, and conflicted loyalties that make him a more psychologically realistic character than earlier idealized versions. His relationship with Arthur involves genuine friendship and mutual respect that makes their eventual conflict more tragic than simple betrayal or moral failure. The Book of Merlin, White's final volume that was published posthumously, addresses the futility of war and the cyclical nature of human violence through Arthur's final conversations with his mentor. The work's pacifist message reflects White's response to the world wars and his conviction that human society must develop alternatives to military solutions for political conflicts. This explicit political engagement demonstrates how modern Arthurian literature could address contemporary issues while maintaining connection to traditional themes and characters. Marion Zimmer Bradley's The Mists of Avalon revolutionized Arthurian literature by retelling the familiar story from the perspective of its female characters, particularly Morgane and Gwen Hwyfar. Bradley's feminist interpretation challenges traditional characterizations by presenting women as active agents, rather than passive objects of male desire or protection. The novel's exploration of goddess religion and pre-Christian spirituality reflects contemporary interest in alternative religious traditions, while providing new interpretive frameworks for understanding the conflict between Arthur's Christian kingdom and older Celtic traditions. Bradley's treatment of the religious conflict between Christianity and paganism transforms what earlier authors presented as a simple triumph of civilization over barbarism into a complex cultural negotiation with losses and gains on both sides. Morgane's role as a priestess of the ancient religion enables her to function as both Arthur's ally and opponent, supporting his political achievements while opposing the cultural changes that accompany Christianization. This religious complexity reflects contemporary interest in religious pluralism and the recovery of suppressed spiritual traditions. The novel's detailed exploration of women's experiences in medieval society addresses topics that earlier Arthurian literature largely ignored, including childbirth, domestic responsibilities, and the limited options available to women within patriarchal social structures. Bradley's female characters possess agency and intelligence that enable them to influence political events while working within the constraints imposed by their social positions. This feminist revision of Arthurian tradition influenced subsequent authors and demonstrated the potential for discovering new meanings within familiar legendary material. Contemporary fantasy authors have continued to find inspiration in Arthurian themes while adapting them to reflect current literary preferences and cultural concerns. Authors like Stephen Lawhead, Bernard Cornwell, and Gillian Bradshaw have created historical novels that attempt to reconstruct the authentic, post-Roman British context in which a historical Arthur might have operated. These works emphasize military realism, political complexity, and cultural authenticity rather than romantic idealization or magical elements. Cornwell's The Warlord Chronicles presents Arthur as a pragmatic military commander operating within the brutal realities of post-Roman British politics. The trilogy's emphasis on tactical details, political manoeuvring, and cultural conflict reflects contemporary interest in historical authenticity while maintaining narrative excitement and character development. Cornwell's Arthur achieves heroic status through practical competence and moral determination rather than supernatural assistance or romantic idealization. The influence of Arthurian themes extends beyond literature into film, television, and popular culture, where visual media have created new interpretive possibilities while reaching audiences far larger than those accessible through written texts. Cinematic adaptations have ranged from spectacular historical epics to intimate character studies, each reflecting the technological capabilities and cultural preferences of their respective eras. The visual representation of Arthurian themes has influenced popular understanding of medieval culture while creating new iconographic traditions that affect subsequent literary and artistic treatments. John Borman's Excalibur represents the most visually ambitious cinematic treatment of Arthurian material, combining spectacular battle sequences with mystical imagery that emphasizes the legendary rather than historical dimensions of the story. The film's use of Wagner's music and elaborate costume design creates a dreamlike atmosphere that transforms familiar narrative elements into archetypal symbols of power, corruption, and redemption. This approach demonstrates how visual media can discover new meanings within traditional material while creating experiences that complement rather than compete with literary treatments. Television adaptations have provided opportunities for more detailed character development and complex narrative structures than feature films typically allow. Series like Merlin and Camelot have reimagined Arthurian characters for contemporary audiences while exploring themes of political responsibility, personal identity, and social change that resonate with current concerns. These adaptations demonstrate the continuing relevance of Arthurian themes, while illustrating how different media can discover new interpretive possibilities within familiar legendary material. The persistence of Arthurian ideals in contemporary culture reflects their continued relevance to fundamental human concerns about leadership, justice, and community. The Round Table remains a powerful symbol of democratic cooperation and shared responsibility, while Arthur himself represents the possibility of principled leadership that serves collective rather than personal interests. These ideals continue to inspire political rhetoric, educational philosophy, and social movements that seek to create more just and equitable societies. The concept of chivalry, though often misunderstood or romanticized, continues to influence contemporary discussions about personal conduct, professional ethics, and social responsibility. The chivalric emphasis on protecting the vulnerable, maintaining personal integrity, and serving causes greater than individual self-interest provides moral frameworks that remain relevant despite dramatic changes in social organization and cultural values. Modern adaptations of chivalric ideals appear in professional codes of conduct, military honor systems, and social movements that emphasize service and sacrifice for collective benefit. The tragic dimension of Arthurian legend speaks to contemporary understanding of the limitations of human achievement and the inevitable failure of even the most noble enterprises. Arthur's kingdom falls not through external conquest, but through internal contradictions and moral failures that reflect universal human weaknesses. This tragic pattern provides frameworks for understanding contemporary political failures and social problems while maintaining hope for renewal and eventual success despite temporary defeats. The enduring appeal of Arthurian legend demonstrates literature's capacity to preserve and transmit cultural values across historical periods and social transformations. The legend's ability to accommodate multiple interpretations and adaptations while maintaining essential thematic coherence illustrates how mythic narratives function as repositories of collective wisdom and aspiration. Each generation discovers new relevance in Arthur's story, while contributing its own insights and concerns to the ongoing development of the tradition. The scholarly study of Arthurian literature has evolved from romantic antiquarianism into sophisticated interdisciplinary investigation that combines literary analysis, historical research, and cultural theory. Contemporary Arthurian studies examines the legend's development within specific historical contexts, while exploring its continuing influence on modern culture and consciousness. This academic engagement ensures that future generations will possess the analytical tools necessary for understanding both the historical development of Arthurian tradition and its continuing relevance to human experience. As we conclude this comprehensive examination of Arthurian legend through the ages, we observe how a shadowy post-Roman British war leader became one of literature's most enduring and influential figures. From the earliest Welsh bardic traditions through medieval French romances to contemporary popular culture, Arthur's story has demonstrated remarkable adaptability while maintaining essential themes of heroic leadership, moral purpose, and tragic nobility. The legend's survival across 15 centuries of cultural change testifies to its fundamental relevance to human concerns about justice, community, and the possibility of achieving noble purposes despite inevitable failure. Whether Arthur existed as a historical figure remains ultimately less important than his continuing function as a symbol of humanity's highest aspirations and most persistent struggles. The Round Table endures not as archaeological artifact, but as metaphor for the kind of society we continue to seek, one where power serves justice, where individual excellence contributes to collective welfare, and where the pursuit of noble ideals justifies the inevitable cost of human endeavour. In this sense, Arthur remains indeed the once and future king, representing not a historical past but an eternal possibility that each generation must discover and create anew.